Deep within the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University sits one of the most perplexing artifacts ever discovered, a bound volume known as the Voynich Manuscript, a text of approximately 240 pages filled with an unknown script that has resisted every attempt at decipherment for over a century. The manuscript itself dates to the early 15th century, based on careful analysis of its vellum and binding materials, yet no scholar has been able to determine who wrote it, what language it employs, or what purpose it was meant to serve, making it a genuine anomaly in the historical record. The pages are adorned with elaborate illustrations depicting unknown plants with impossible anatomies, strange astronomical diagrams, and mysterious human figures engaged in inexplicable activities within architectural spaces or natural settings, all rendered in a curious and distinctly alien visual language. The text itself is written in a cipher or unknown alphabet consisting of characters that appear nowhere else in documented human history, and despite the combined efforts of cryptographers, linguists, medieval scholars, and amateur enthusiasts numbering in the thousands, the manuscript has yielded virtually no meaningful secrets about its content or creator. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Voynich manuscript lies in humanity's deep discomfort with the truly unknowable. For we are creatures who interpret patterns and seek meaning in all things, and when confronted with an artifact that seems to be deliberately communicating something while simultaneously concealing it completely, we become obsessed with unlocking what feels like it should be understandable. This compulsion to solve the unsolvable has paradoxically given the manuscript extraordinary cultural significance despite its opacity, transforming it from a mere historical curiosity into a symbol of mystery itself, something that In the autumn of 1888, the impoverished Whitechapel district of London became the hunting ground for a serial killer whose identity remains shrouded in mystery more than a century later. Between August and November of that year, at least 5 women, most of them sex workers struggling in abject poverty, were brutally murdered and mutilated in a manner that suggested anatomical knowledge and surgical precision. The killer, who adopted the infamous moniker Jack the Ripper through letters sent to newspapers and police, would strike under the cover of darkness, leaving his victims with deep throat lacerations and removed internal organs displayed with deliberate care. The murders terrorized an entire city and spawned an investigation so chaotic and poorly coordinated that countless leads were abandoned, suspects released without thorough questioning, and evidence contaminated or lost entirely. What makes the Ripper case perpetually unsolvable is not merely the absence of definitive forensic evidence, which is understandable given the era, but rather the sheer volume of plausible suspects, each supported by circumstantial details and each capable of fitting the fragmentary profile that investigators cobbled together. A Polish barber surgeon, a royal physician, a deranged immigrant, a duke's illegitimate child, a mentally disturbed sailor, and dozens of others have all been proposed with conviction by historians and amateur investigators. The psychological mechanism driving this endless speculation is our profound discomfort with true randomness and unresolved violence. The human mind abhors a vacuum of explanation and will fill it with narrative, creating elaborate chains of logic that feel satisfying even when fundamentally unprovable. We have essentially normalized the impossibility of solving the Ripper murders by transforming them into cultural mythology, a dark legend that persists precisely because it cannot be conclusively settled, allowing On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man using the alias Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 355 from Portland to Seattle, carrying a briefcase that he claimed contained a bomb, and when the aircraft reached cruising altitude, he handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner informing her of his explosive device and demanding $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a refund for his ticket. All of which were provided by authorities once the plane landed in Seattle, where he released all 36 passengers and 2 flight attendants in exchange for the money and parachutes. And then, as the aircraft flew toward Mexico City at minimum speed with its landing gear down and flaps lowered, he descended the rear stairs into the darkness and disappeared into the rainy November night over southwestern Washington, becoming one of the most captivating unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The psychological mechanism that has sustained fascination with D.B. Cooper for over 5 decades lies in the perfect intersection of audacity, uncertainty, and cultural mythology, where a crime that was simultaneously methodical and almost whimsical captured the imagination of a nation that had grown weary of institutional authority. And the fact that he successfully disappeared suggested that perhaps one ordinary person could outwit the vast machinery of law enforcement and governmental power in ways that seemed impossible in the modern surveillance age. Despite the Federal Bureau of Investigation's intensive investigation involving hundreds of agents and tips numbering in the thousands, despite sonar searches of rivers and dredging operations, despite the discovery of $8,000 of the ransom money buried near the Columbia River in 1980, despite countless suspects proposed and investigated over the decades, from Richard Floyd. Between 1968 and 1970, a serial killer operating in Northern California claimed responsibility for multiple murders through cryptic letters and ciphers sent to local newspapers, establishing himself as one of America's most infamous unsolved criminal cases. The Zodiac Killer, as he called himself, murdered at least 5 confirmed victims, though he claimed responsibility for many more, with some estimates suggesting he killed up to 40 people across California during his active period. What made this killer particularly distinctive was his deliberate engagement with the media and law enforcement, sending taunting letters written in a theatrical and boastful manner, along with elaborate ciphers and coded messages designed to showcase his intelligence and taunt investigators. The killer would often reference his crimes in detail, provide personal information, and even include cryptic symbols and astrological references, suggesting a psychological need for recognition and acknowledgement of his actions. Despite extensive investigations involving multiple law enforcement agencies and thousands of suspects interviewed over decades, no definitive identification has ever been confirmed, making the Zodiac Killer case one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The persistence of this mystery exists largely because the killer operated before modern DNA technology became standard in investigations, because his killings spanned multiple jurisdictions which complicated coordinated police work, and because the cryptic communications he left behind, while demonstrating intelligence and planning, did not necessarily provide investigators with the specific physical or biographical details needed to narrow down suspects with certainty. In February 1959, a group of 9 experienced hikers led by Igor Dyatlov set out to traverse the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia during one of the harshest winters on record. And what began as a straightforward mountaineering expedition would transform into one of history's most perplexing disappearances when rescue teams discovered their camp weeks later in a state of inexplicable chaos. The hikers had established their tent on the slopes of Kalet-Siakal Mountain, but at some point during the night, they fled their shelter in temperatures that dropped to far below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, cutting their way out from the inside of the tent rather than using the proper exit, and they scattered across the frozen landscape wearing only partial clothing despite the lethal conditions that surrounded them. The subsequent investigation revealed that all 9 members had died from exposure or injuries, yet the physical evidence painted a troubling picture that seemed to contradict itself. For some bodies bore signs of internal injuries without corresponding external wounds, and one victim was found missing her tongue and eyes, while another displayed radiation burns on his clothing that authorities could not adequately explain. The psychological mechanism that sustains this mystery involves the human need to construct narrative coherence from fragmented evidence, as our minds resist accepting that sometimes the chain of causation leading to a tragedy remains irrevocably broken, and we find ourselves drawn toward increasingly exotic explanations such as military testing, supernatural forces, or extraterrestrial intervention, rather than accepting that the exact sequence of events might simply have been obscured forever by time and the harsh environment. On July 2, 1937, pioneering aviator Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan embarked on their most ambitious journey yet, attempting to circumnavigate the globe along its equatorial line in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra aircraft. And as they approached Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the Pacific Ocean measuring just 1.6 miles long and half a mile wide, radio communications between Earhart and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca became increasingly strained and confused, with Earhart reporting that they were unable to locate the island despite being in the vicinity. And then, after a final transmission stating that fuel was running low, her voice simply ceased, and the aircraft vanished without explanation into the vast expanse of ocean. The official investigation concluded that Earhart and Noonan had simply run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific, their bodies and aircraft lost to the depths forever, a conclusion that seems logical given the remote location and the limitations of 1937 aviation technology. However, numerous alternative theories have emerged over the decades, including the possibility that Earhart and Noonan crash-landed on Gardner Island, now called Nikimararo, where they may have survived for some time as castaways before succumbing to the harsh conditions, or more sensational claims that they were captured by the Japanese military, or even that Earhart survived and assumed a new identity, and while each theory possesses certain circumstantial evidence and passionate adherents, none has been conclusively proven, and the lack of verifiable physical evidence has allowed speculation to flourish and persist. What makes the Earhart disappearance so compelling and resistant to final resolution is that it represents a perfect convergence of genuine mystery, incomplete historical records, the allure of a legendary figure, and the human impulse to construct. The Bermuda Triangle represents one of the most persistent geographical mysteries in modern consciousness, encompassing a loosely defined region in the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, an area of approximately 500,000 square miles where the ocean depths reach some of the most extreme measurements on Earth. Throughout the 20th century, numerous vessels and aircraft vanished within this region under circumstances that captured public imagination, including the disappearance of Flight 19 in 1945, when 5 Navy bombers with 14 crew members simply ceased radio contact during a training mission, followed by the rescue aircraft sent to locate them, creating a narrative of inexplicable loss that would define the Triangle's reputation for decades to come. Additional incidents contributed to this mythology, from cargo ships that transmitted no distress signals before disappearing to private planes that vanished without trace, each case adding another layer to the collective mystery that seemed to suggest something fundamentally dangerous lurked beneath those waters or within that airspace, something that defied conventional explanation and challenged our understanding of maritime and aviation safety. However, the psychological mechanism underlying this enduring mystery lies primarily in our human tendency toward pattern recognition and our inclination to construct narrative coherence from random events, a cognitive bias that causes us to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated disappearances simply because they occurred within a designated geographical area. The Bermuda Triangle's reputation becomes self-reinforcing through selective memory and publication bias, wherein disappearances within the region receive disproportionate attention and dramatic retelling, while equally mysterious or more frequent losses elsewhere go largely unnoticed, creating a Standing on the windswept Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, Stonehenge remains one of the most iconic and enigmatic structures ever constructed by human hands, yet its original purpose has eluded definitive explanation for centuries despite countless scholarly investigations and archaeological expeditions. Built sometime between 5,000 and 4,500 years ago during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, this arrangement of massive stone megaliths, some weighing more than 50 tons, and transported from quarries over 150 miles away, represents an extraordinary commitment of labor, resources, and organizational capability that suggests a purpose of profound cultural or spiritual significance. The stones themselves are arranged in concentric circles and precise geometric patterns that align remarkably with celestial events, particularly the summer and winter solstices, leading many researchers to theorize that Stonehenge functioned as an astronomical observatory or calendar by which prehistoric peoples could track the movements of the sun and moon across the heavens. Beyond astronomical alignment, archaeological evidence suggests multiple possible functions layered atop one another. A sacred temple for religious ceremonies and ritual gatherings, a burial ground where cremated remains of the dead were interred within its circular boundaries, a healing sanctuary where the afflicted came seeking cures through proximity to the stones themselves, or perhaps a gathering place where distant communities assembled for seasonal festivals and communal celebrations that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. The psychological appeal of these various theories lies in humanity's fundamental need to impose rational meaning and coherence upon ancient mysteries, to imagine our predecessors as driven by comprehensible motivations, whether scientific, spiritual, or social in nature. On a remote volcanic island in the South Pacific, roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, stand nearly 900 enormous stone figures known as moai, carved from volcanic rock and arranged across the landscape in patterns that suggest profound ceremonial significance, yet remain fundamentally inexplicable in their purpose and construction methods. These monolithic statues, some weighing as much as 80 tons and reaching heights of over 30 feet, were created by the Rapa Nui people over several centuries beginning around 1200 years ago, carved with simple stone tools from the island's volcanic quarries and somehow transported across the terrain to their final positions, often on elaborate stone platforms called ahu. Yet the precise engineering techniques employed to move and erect these massive figures have never been definitively explained despite centuries of archaeological investigation and modern scientific analysis. The civilization that built these monuments eventually collapsed, with evidence suggesting that resource depletion, environmental degradation, and the demands of moai production may have contributed to widespread societal decline, though the exact sequence of events remains obscured by time and incomplete historical records. The fundamental mystery persists in understanding how a relatively small population on an isolated island could have mobilized the enormous collective effort required to quarry, shape, and transport these colossal figures, while simultaneously maintaining the agricultural systems necessary to feed themselves, suggesting either organizational capabilities far more sophisticated than we can reconstruct or motivations so compelling that they overrode practical concerns for survival. High in the arid plateaus of southern Peru, sprawling across roughly 1,400 square kilometers of desert landscape, exist enormous geometric patterns and animal figures etched into the earth with such precision and scale that their true purpose remains one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. Figures that can only be fully appreciated from the air, drawn by an ancient civilization between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE. And yet the fundamental question of why they were created persists, without definitive answer, despite more than a century of intensive scholarly investigation. The lines themselves, some stretching for kilometers in length, depict hummingbirds, spiders, monkeys, and elaborate geometric designs with such mathematical accuracy that observers have proposed theories ranging from ancient astronomical calendars to landing strips for extraterrestrial visitors. From ritual pathways for ceremonial processions to vast agricultural fertility symbols meant to invoke divine intervention and ensure bountiful harvests for the Nazca people who inhabited this region. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with these mysterious geoglyphs operates through what researchers identify as pattern recognition combined with the human tendency toward teleology, our inherent need to believe that such monumental effort must have served some grand, identifiable purpose, making it psychologically uncomfortable to accept that their meaning might be lost to time, or that the creators themselves may have viewed these works through a cultural and spiritual framework entirely alien to modern comprehension. We have normalized the mystery itself, treating the Nazca Lines not as an unsolved puzzle, but as a landmark that embodies our civilization's desire to impose rational meaning upon ancient creation, suggesting that somewhere within the geometric precision and astronomical alignments lies a key to understanding, yet Kanti. The legend of Atlantis originates from the philosophical dialogues of Plato, written around 400 BCE, in which he describes an advanced island civilization that existed some 9,000 years before his own time, a sophisticated society built upon concentric rings of land and water, possessed of remarkable technology and naval prowess, yet ultimately destroyed in a single catastrophic event and swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night of violent upheaval. Plato presented this account within the context of a theoretical discussion about ideal societies and the hubris of civilizations, embedding it so convincingly within his narrative framework that subsequent generations of scholars, explorers, and dreamers have spent millennia attempting to locate the physical remains of this vanished world, searching through the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and countless other bodies of water around the globe in pursuit of archaeological evidence that might confirm its actual historical existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent fascination appears rooted in humanity's fundamental desire to discover material proof of lost knowledge and advanced ancient civilizations, a longing that transforms a philosophical allegory into what many believe must be historical fact. Particularly because Plato's description possessed such internal consistency and spatial detail that it seemed to many readers to be based upon genuine accounts, rather than imaginative speculation designed to illustrate a moral argument. This cognitive bias, wherein compelling narrative detail unconsciously substitutes itself for verification, has led generations of otherwise rational individuals to propose increasingly elaborate theories, from sunken Mediterranean islands to volcanic catastrophes in Santorini to transatlantic locations in the Americas, each interpretation attempting to retrofit historical events and geological phenomena into the frame. On December 2, 1872, the merchant ship Mary Celeste was discovered adrift in the Atlantic Ocean between Portugal and Gibraltar, presenting one of maritime history's most enduring puzzles that has captivated investigators for over a century and a half. The vessel, a brigantine carrying industrial alcohol and bound for Genoa, Italy, was found completely abandoned by its crew of 13 people. Yet the ship itself remained largely intact with no signs of struggle, fire, or catastrophic damage that would necessitate such a sudden evacuation. The lifeboats were missing, the cargo was undisturbed, personal belongings remained in the crew's quarters untouched, a half-eaten meal was discovered on the table, and Captain Benjamin Briggs' family Bible lay open in his cabin, suggesting that whoever departed this vessel did so with inexplicable urgency and mysterious purpose. The ship's log had ceased recording entries, and the wheel was lashed, indicating that someone had attempted to maintain course even as the crew seemingly vanished into thin air without explanation, without bodies, and without any logical reason for abandoning a seaworthy vessel that posed no immediate threat to survival. What renders this historical mystery psychologically compelling is the fundamental human need to explain the inexplicable through rational frameworks, causing our minds to construct increasingly elaborate theories about mutiny, piracy, sea monsters, or paranormal phenomena, each explanation attempting to impose order and meaning upon an event that stubbornly resists comprehension. The mystery persists not because evidence is genuinely absent, but rather because the most plausible explanations, such as sudden waterspouts, toxic gas emissions from the alcohol cargo, or miscommunication resulting in hasty evacuation, fail to satisfy our deeper psychological hunger for dramatic narrative and extraordinary causation. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, in a remote region of Siberia near the Tunguska River, something catastrophic occurred that leveled approximately 80 million trees across an area of roughly 2,000 square kilometers, yet to this day remains one of the most perplexing and unexplained events in recorded history. Witnesses in distant settlements reported seeing an enormous bright flash across the sky, followed by a powerful explosion that produced a blast wave so intense it knocked people down from miles away. Yet no impact crater was ever discovered, no meteorite fragments were conclusively identified, and no remains of any terrestrial object could adequately explain the devastation. The explosion occurred over an unpopulated region, which meant that casualties were minimal, but the sheer scale of destruction suggested something far more powerful than any conventional explosion or natural phenomenon that scientists of that era could reasonably account for. Theories emerged almost immediately suggesting everything from a comet impact to a meteor explosion in the atmosphere, yet the lack of physical evidence and the remote location meant that serious scientific investigation was delayed for decades, allowing mystery and speculation to fill the void. The human mind, when confronted with catastrophic events that defy conventional explanation, naturally gravitates toward the most dramatic possibilities, from extraterrestrial visitors to secret weapons testing, because these narratives feel more satisfying than admitting fundamental uncertainty. We construct elaborate explanations because the alternative, accepting that some phenomena remain genuinely inexplicable despite our scientific capabilities, creates an unsettling cognitive dissonance that most people find psychologically uncomfortable to maintain. Imagine pulling a corroded bronze object from the depths of the Mediterranean Sea, an object so impossibly sophisticated that it seems to belong not to ancient Greece, but to the scientific revolution centuries hence, and you have discovered the Antikythera mechanism, one of history's most perplexing artifacts. In 1901, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera found themselves exploring a Roman shipwreck that had rested on the ocean floor for nearly 2,000 years. And among the cargo of marble statues and pottery lay this fist-sized lump of calcified bronze and wood, corroded beyond immediate recognition into what appeared merely to be an unremarkable piece of ancient debris. When researchers finally examined this mysterious object closely, using the best technology available to them at the time, they discovered something that fundamentally challenged everything historians believed about ancient mechanical knowledge. For inside the corroded exterior lay an intricate system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, each precisely crafted with teeth in ratios that would allow the mechanism to perform complex astronomical calculations with remarkable accuracy. The device appears designed to track the movements of celestial bodies, predicting solar and lunar eclipses, determining zodiac positions, and measuring the passage of time with a sophistication that researchers now understand surpassed anything else from that era by more than 1,000 years, suggesting a technological sophistication that seems to emerge from nowhere in the historical record, with no obvious predecessor and no known successor, making it virtually impossible to determine how ancient craftsmen developed such extraordinary mechanical knowledge, or why this technology appeared to vanish entirely after the fall of Rome, leaving no trace of similar devices and no written explanations of its construction methods or theoretical basis. On August 15, 1977, a radio astronomer named Jerry Amon was working the night shift at the Big Ear Radio Telescope in Ohio, monitoring signals from deep space in search of extraterrestrial transmissions, when he noticed something extraordinary printed on the computer readout tape before him, a narrow-band signal of unusual strength emanating from the Chi Sagittarii star group that lasted for approximately 72 seconds. So remarkable that Amon circled it in red ink and wrote the word "wow" in the margin, a reaction that would give the signal its enduring name and cement it in the annals of astronomical mystery. The signal's intensity suggested an artificial source rather than a natural cosmic phenomenon, and its specific frequency and narrowband characteristics made it appear almost deliberately crafted. Yet when Amon and his colleagues attempted to relocate and verify the transmission on subsequent nights, they found nothing but silence, no repetition, no follow-up signal. Just that single 30-second window of what might have been humanity's first documented contact attempt from beyond our world. What makes the WOW signal so psychologically captivating is precisely this combination of specificity and elusiveness, the fact that we have quantifiable data about something extraordinary yet cannot quite grasp what it was, creating a kind of intellectual itch that cannot be scratched, a mystery that sits right at the boundary between the explainable and the impossible, between the known and the unknowable. For decades, astronomers and enthusiasts have proposed countless theories ranging from distant alien civilizations attempting communication to radio reflections from satellites or atmospheric phenomena, yet none have ever achieved consensus or proven definitively capable of explaining what the Big Ear detected. And in this persistent uncertainty, the WOW signal has become a cultural touchstone for our collectee. Deep beneath the archaeological layers of a Minoan palace on the island of Crete lies one of antiquity's most perplexing artifacts, a circular clay disc no larger than a dinner plate, stamped with mysterious symbols in a spiral pattern that has confounded scholars for more than a century. Discovered in 1908 by Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier, the Phaistos Disc contains 45 distinct pictorial symbols arranged in a clockwise spiral across both its surfaces, each symbol pressed into the soft clay using individual stamps in what appears to be one of the earliest examples of printing technology in human history. The symbols themselves depict recognizable objects such as human heads, birds, fish, tools, and religious emblems, yet their specific meanings remain entirely unknown, and no other artifact from the same period contains this particular writing system or symbol set, making it impossibly difficult to establish any comparative linguistic or contextual framework for understanding its purpose. Scholars have proposed countless theories regarding its function, suggesting it might have been a game board, a religious talisman, a musical instrument guide, an astronomical calendar, or even a ceremonial object of unknown significance. Yet each theory crumbles under scrutiny when examined against what little evidence exists. The psychological mechanism at work in our fascination with the Phaistos Disc stems from humanity's deep need to decode hidden messages and extract meaning from the unknown, particularly when faced with an artifact that appears intentional and deliberate in its creation, yet yields no comprehensible interpretation despite our most rigorous analytical efforts. We have become so accustomed to celebrating our ability to decipher ancient languages and unlock the secrets of lost civilizations that the existence of something we cannot read troubles us profoundly, challenging our assumption that sufficient exper. In January of 1947, the mutilated body of a 22-year-old woman named Elizabeth Short was discovered in an empty lot in Los Angeles. Her corpse severed at the waist with surgical precision and drained of blood, her face slashed from the corners of her mouth toward her ears in a grotesque parody of a smile, her body carefully posed and cleaned as if displayed for maximum shock value and public horror. Elizabeth Short, who had earned the nickname Black Dahlia among the Los Angeles social scene due to her striking dark hair and her preference for black clothing, had vanished days earlier after a night out in the city, and her discovery ignited one of the most sensational murder investigations in American criminal history, drawing thousands of confessions, countless suspects, and the intense scrutiny of both the police department and the voracious media outlets that transformed the case into an endless spectacle of speculation and theory. The psychological mechanism underlying the Black Dahlia case's enduring grip on the American consciousness stems from the convergence of multiple compelling elements. The brutal and artful nature of the killing suggested a killer of unusual sophistication and control. The victim was young and beautiful, fitting the archetypal narrative of innocent beauty destroyed, and the case remained unsolved despite exhaustive investigation, leaving the public with an aching void that the human mind naturally seeks to fill with explanation, meaning, and closure that never came. Decades have passed since Elizabeth Short's body was discovered, yet the case persists in the cultural imagination with remarkable tenacity, spawning countless books, films, podcasts, and amateur investigations that suggest something deeper than mere historical curiosity drives this fascination. On December 3, 1948, a well-dressed man was discovered dead on Somerton Beach near Adelaide, Australia, with no identification whatsoever, and in his pocket was found a scrap of paper bearing only two words in Persian script, Tamam Shud, meaning the end or it is finished. The body belonged to a man of unknown identity, later called the Somerton Man, and he appeared to have been poisoned, though the exact method remained elusive despite extensive medical examination and toxicological analysis that revealed nothing conclusive. Over the following weeks and months, investigators uncovered a series of peculiar details that only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The man's clothing bore no labels, suggesting they had been deliberately removed. His teeth were distinctive yet matched no dental records in any database they could access, and his physical appearance suggested he might have been of mixed European and Asian descent, though this remained speculation. The scrap of paper with Tamam Shud was eventually traced to a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a Persian poetry collection, and investigators theorized this might be a coded message or suicide note, yet no cipher or pattern could ever be definitively established or proven. The human mind naturally seeks completion and narrative coherence, and when confronted with fragmented information, we construct stories to fill the gaps, assembling disparate clues into patterns that feel meaningful even when no genuine connection exists. In the case of the Somerton Man, decades of investigation produced numerous theories ranging from espionage during the Cold War to involvement with organized crime to simple murder by person or persons unknown. Yet each theory relied as much on speculation as evidence. Deep within the waters off the coast of Nova Scotia lies a small island that has captivated treasure hunters, historians, and dreamers for nearly 3 centuries, transforming an otherwise unremarkable piece of land into one of the most obsessively investigated locations in North America. Oak Island, as it is known, became the focal point of an enduring mystery when in 1795, a young boy supposedly discovered a depression in the earth that suggested something had been buried deliberately beneath the surface. And from that moment forward, successive generations have launched increasingly elaborate expeditions to uncover what lies hidden below. The most famous discovery was what became known as the Money Pit, a deep shaft that produced a series of tantalizing artifacts, including coconut fiber at depths inconsistent with natural occurrence, metal crosses, and various implements that seemed far too ancient to explain through conventional means. The legend grew exponentially throughout the 1800s and into the modern era, with theories ranging from the plausible, such as pirate treasure or colonial military caches, to the fantastical, including Templar gold, ancient manuscripts describing secret knowledge, and even extraterrestrial artifacts. What makes Oak Island particularly compelling is the psychological mechanism underlying its enduring mystique, which operates through a potent combination of incomplete evidence, tantalizing partial discoveries, and the human tendency to pattern-seek even in random or naturally occurring phenomena. Each excavation unearths something that could potentially be significant, yet nothing definitively proves a deliberate treasure burial, allowing believers to maintain hope, while skeptics question whether the entire mystery is largely constructed from coincidence and misinterpretation. In the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, there rests one of Christianity's most contested and enigmatic relics, a linen cloth approximately 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, bearing the faint image of a man's body front and back. This is the Shroud of Turin, and for nearly 7 centuries, believers have maintained that this cloth is the actual burial garment of Jesus Christ himself, stained with his blood and bearing the miraculous imprint of his crucified form. The image shows a bearded man with shoulder-length hair, bearing wounds consistent with crucifixion as described in gospel accounts, including marks from what appear to be a crown of thorns, piercing in the side, and nail wounds through the hands and feet. The shroud has been preserved, studied, debated, and venerated by millions who view it as tangible proof of Christ's existence and suffering, a physical bridge between the historical and the divine. Yet the very nature of how this image was created remains utterly inexplicable by conventional scientific means. The image itself is extraordinarily faint, consisting only of a discoloration of the linen fibers that penetrates merely the topmost layer of threads, suggesting that whatever created it acted with remarkable precision and specificity, affecting only the surface without burning, staining, or chemically altering the cloth in conventional ways. When examined under ultraviolet light, no fluorescence appears, indicating that the image was not created by paints or dyes. The image also possesses 3-dimensional properties that suggest it was created by some form of radiation or heat source emanating from the body itself, yet no known process in medieval or ancient times could produce such an effect, nor could any modern attempt at reproduction satisfactorily replicate the shroud's exact characteristics. Deep within the historical consciousness of Western civilization lies one of antiquity's most sought-after objects, the Ark of the Covenant, a chest described in biblical texts as containing the stone tablets upon which God inscribed the 10 Commandments, along with other sacred relics of profound spiritual significance. According to ancient accounts, this golden chest, measuring roughly 4 feet in length and crafted with an elaborate mercy seat crowned by golden cherubim, resided first in the portable tabernacle during Israel's wilderness wanderings and later in the inner sanctum of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, where it remained for centuries as the holiest object in Jewish religious practice. Yet sometime after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Ark vanished entirely from historical record, and despite exhaustive searches across countless generations, no credible evidence of its existence has ever been discovered in modern times, leaving scholars and archaeologists to grapple with a profound mystery that transcends mere historical inquiry. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Ark's disappearance operates through several interconnected layers. The human tendency to attribute cosmic significance to physical objects, the deep narrative appeal of lost treasures with transcendent spiritual properties, and our inherent difficulty accepting that something so monumentally important could simply cease to exist without explanation or trace. Countless theories have emerged to fill this void, from claims that Ethiopian monks spirited it away to Axum, to suggestions that it was hidden beneath the Temple Mount, to proposals that it was destroyed or deliberately concealed by Hebrew priests anticipating destruction. What remains striking is how readily we have normalized the absence of concrete evidence despite centuries of exploration, as if the very mysteriousness of the Ark has become more valuable and meaning. Deep beneath the streets of Baghdad, archaeologists uncovered a peculiar collection of clay jars dating back approximately 2,000 years to the Parthian Empire, each containing a copper cylinder nestled inside an iron rod, with the space between them filled with an acidic substance that has long since evaporated into mystery. These artifacts, discovered in the 1930s and subsequently labeled the Baghdad Batteries, presented a puzzle that would capture the imagination of researchers and the public alike for generations to come. as their construction bears an undeniable resemblance to the basic components of a modern electrochemical cell. The clay vessels themselves are unremarkable in appearance, yet their internal architecture suggests a deliberate purpose, with the copper and iron metals positioned in a specific arrangement that would theoretically produce an electrical current if filled with an electrolytic solution such as vinegar or lemon juice, raising the intriguing question of whether ancient civilizations possessed the knowledge and technology to generate electricity. This theoretical capability has given rise to an enduring fascination with the Baghdad batteries, prompting countless experiments in which modern researchers have successfully recreated the electrical phenomenon, demonstrating that these ancient objects would indeed function as primitive batteries capable of producing a small but measurable voltage. Yet despite this compelling evidence of electrical generation, there remains profound uncertainty regarding the actual purpose these devices served in the ancient world, with scholarly consensus remaining frustratingly elusive as experts debate whether they were used for electroplating, medical applications, religious rituals, or perhaps something we have yet to comprehend. In the year 1587, a group of English colonists led by John White established a settlement on Roanoke Island, located off the coast of what is now North Carolina, with the intention of creating a permanent foothold for England in the New World. After several months, White returned to England to gather supplies and reinforcements, leaving behind approximately 115 men, women, and children, including his own daughter Eleanor and his newborn granddaughter Virginia, the first English child born in North America. When White finally managed to return to the colony 3 years later, delayed by wars in Europe and the demands of the crown, he discovered the settlement completely abandoned, the fortifications torn down, and the colonists nowhere to be found. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree without a cross that would have indicated distress, and yet no trace of the settlers was ever discovered despite extensive searches. The human mind, when confronted with the absolute disappearance of an entire community, naturally seeks patterns and explanations because we are neurologically wired to create narratives from fragments of information and incomplete data. Perhaps they were killed by Native Americans, or perhaps they integrated into local tribes, or perhaps they attempted to reach another colony, or perhaps they perished from disease and starvation, and each theory feels equally plausible because we are examining a historical void where only speculation can flourish. What makes this mystery particularly resistant to resolution is how completely a colonial settlement can vanish, leaving almost no archaeological evidence, no bones, no artifacts that might tell the final story of these people who simply ceased to exist in the historical record. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport bound for Beijing Capital International Airport with 239 people aboard, and within hours, the aircraft simply vanished from radar screens as though it had ceased to exist. The Boeing 777 jet, one of the most reliable commercial aircraft ever built, disappeared over the South China Sea during what should have been a routine overnight flight, triggering what would become aviation's greatest unsolved mystery and one of the most extensive and expensive search operations in modern history. The aircraft's transponder was deliberately disabled, and the plane's course was manually altered to fly westward across the Indian Ocean, away from established flight paths and away from populated areas, suggesting a deliberate act rather than mechanical failure or accident. Despite coordinated search efforts involving multiple nations, underwater drone expeditions covering vast expanses of the Indian Ocean, and the recovery of scattered debris washing ashore on distant coastlines, the main wreckage was never found, leaving investigators without the flight data recorders that might explain what happened in those final hours. The psychological weight of this mystery stems from our modern expectation that in an era of constant satellite surveillance, GPS tracking, and sophisticated communication systems, a large commercial aircraft cannot simply disappear without explanation, yet Malaysian 370 shattered this assumption entirely. We have become accustomed to believing that the skies are thoroughly monitored, that nothing of significance can occur without detection, and that modern technology has eliminated the possibility of such vanishing acts, creating a cognitive dissonance when confronted with evidence that contradicts these deeply held assumptions about our interconnected world. In the year 1483, two young boys disappeared from the Tower of London under circumstances that would perplex historians and the public for more than 5 centuries, creating one of England's most enduring mysteries. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were the legitimate heirs to the English throne, placed in protective custody within the Tower by their uncle Richard, who claimed he needed to safeguard them during a period of political instability following their father's death. The boys were seen regularly at first, playing in the gardens and moving about the fortress grounds, watched by numerous servants and officials who could attest to their presence and well-being. Yet gradually, as weeks turned into months, the sightings became less frequent, the boys appeared less often in public view, and eventually they vanished almost entirely from the historical record, leaving behind only questions and speculation about their ultimate fate. Some contemporary accounts suggest they were murdered on their uncle's orders, allowing him to claim the throne as Richard III without legitimate heirs to challenge his rule, while other sources propose they escaped, were spirited away to safety by loyal supporters, or perhaps died of natural causes and were quietly buried to avoid scandal. The mystery persists because no bodies were ever definitively identified, no confession was ever obtained, and the available evidence can be interpreted to support multiple competing narratives. Historical investigations conducted centuries later, including the examination of skeletal remains discovered in the tower in 1600, proved inconclusive, as the bones could not be definitively proven to belong to the young princes or conclusively dated to the period in question. On the night of December 25, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family experienced one of the most perplexing disappearances in American history when 5 of their children vanished without a trace from their home during a fire. The family had gathered for Christmas Eve, with parents George and Jenny Sodder watching over their 10 children as the household settled in for the evening. Yet in the early morning hours, a fire broke out in the wooden structure, and when the smoke cleared and the flames subsided, 5 children between the ages of 5 and 14 were simply gone. The official investigation concluded that the children had perished in the flames, consumed entirely by the intense heat, yet the Sodder family insisted this explanation defied all logic and physical evidence, for the remains of other family members were discovered in the rubble, yet no bones, no teeth, no fragments of the 5 missing children could be recovered despite thorough excavations of the site. The psychological mechanism that allows such a disappearance to remain unresolved for decades rests upon the intersection of conflicting narratives, where authorities presented an explanation that satisfied bureaucratic closure, while the grieving family possessed intimate knowledge of inconsistencies that the official record refused to acknowledge, creating a chasm between institutional truth and lived experience. The fire investigator himself later admitted uncertainty about the conclusion, and curious details emerged over the years, including a phone call placed by someone claiming to be one of the missing children years later, and photographs that allegedly showed one of the girls alive in a convent, suggesting possibilities that ranged from kidnapping to human trafficking networks operating in rural America during the post-war period. On August 20, 1966, 2 men were discovered dead on a hillside in the Nitri region of Brazil, lying peacefully side by side with their hands folded across their chests, dressed in identical suits and wearing homemade lead masks covering their eyes, connected by a single cord that bound them together in death. The men were identified as Marcelo da Silva Costa and Manuel Pereira de Cruz, though their identities would later become central to the mystery rather than a solution to it, for no explanation emerged from authorities that could adequately account for their deaths or the peculiar circumstances surrounding their discovery. Near their bodies lay an empty water bottle, a damp cloth, some money, and a note written in Portuguese that read simply, 1630, be at the indicated place, 19 minutes of external respiratory apparatus, with the repetition of the final words suggesting either transcription error or psychological disturbance at the moment of writing. The lead masks themselves appeared to be crude constructions, fashioned from lead plates and thick glass lenses, presumably designed to shield the eyes from some intense light source or perhaps to facilitate some form of mystical experience that the men believed they were pursuing. Investigations into their backgrounds revealed little clarity, for one was a factory worker and the other an electronics technician, suggesting perhaps some shared interest in experimental equipment or fringe scientific pursuits, yet no definitive evidence emerged regarding what they had actually been attempting on that fateful afternoon. The mystery deepens when considering the apparent willingness with which they had positioned themselves, for there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that either man had resisted or attempted to flee from whatever fate befell them, implying instead a voluntary participation in whatever ritual or experiment they had undirt. Scattered across the peatlands of northern Europe, particularly in Ireland, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of remarkably preserved human remains dating back thousands of years, preserved within the acidic and oxygen-poor environments of ancient bogs in a state so pristine that the details of their final moments remain eerily intact and visible to modern observers. These bog bodies, as they are known in archaeological circles, present one of history's most puzzling and disturbing mysteries, for many of them bear unmistakable evidence of violent deaths, ritualistic practices, or deliberate killings that have never been adequately explained by conventional historical understanding. Some individuals were discovered with nooses still around their necks, others with deep wounds to their bodies, and still others arranged in positions suggesting they were carefully placed in the bog rather than simply abandoned. Yet the reasons behind these deaths and the identities of the victims remain frustratingly unknown to researchers who study them. The preservation is so extraordinary that skin, hair, organs, and even tattoos remain visible after millennia underground, allowing archaeologists to examine these ancient people as if they had died mere decades ago rather than centuries or thousands of years past. The human mind struggles to comprehend why so many individuals would have met violent ends in these same locations across such vast stretches of time, and whether these deaths represent murders, ritual sacrifices, executions, or something else entirely becomes a question that persists without clear resolution. We have grown accustomed to accepting these remains as archaeological curiosities, objects for study and categorization, yet the fundamental truth remains that these were real people whose final moments were traumatic and whose stories have been lost to time, leaving us to speculate endlessly about civilization's th. Among the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon stand as perhaps the most elusive and contested of all, a marvel that may have never existed at all, yet persists so vividly in historical accounts and popular imagination that it has become more real in collective memory than perhaps it ever was in physical form. Ancient writers described a terraced garden of extraordinary beauty, supposedly constructed by King Nebuchadnezzar II around 600 BCE as a gift to his homesick Median wife, featuring exotic plants, flowing water systems that cascaded down multiple levels, and lush vegetation suspended impossibly above the arid landscape of Mesopotamia. The garden supposedly rose above the city walls in a series of graduated arches and vaults, with plants and flowers arranged in such a way that from a distance it appeared as though nature itself had defied gravity and logic, creating a vertical paradise in a region dominated by flat, dusty plains and the serpentine Euphrates River. No archaeological evidence has ever been definitively uncovered to prove the gardens actually existed, and no contemporary Babylonian records mention them, which raises profound questions about how such an ostensibly magnificent structure could leave virtually no trace of itself. Historians and archaeologists have proposed that the gardens may have been real but lost to time and geological change, or that they may have been conflated with other royal gardens known to exist in the region, or most provocatively, that they were an invention of later Greek and Roman writers who embellished accounts they had heard through travelers and merchants, gradually building them up into legend. Yet despite the absence of physical evidence and the dubious nature of the historical record, the Hanging Gardens persist in our cultural consciousness as an iconic symbol of ancient engineering prowess and human ambition, inspiring countless artistic. In the small English village of Woolpit, nestled in the county of Suffolk during the 12th century, an event occurred that would perplex chroniclers and scholars for centuries to come, one that remains inexplicable to this very day. According to the accounts recorded by contemporary monks and documented in historical texts, two children with distinctly green-tinted skin emerged from a wolf pit near the village, speaking in a language no one could understand, dressed in clothing of an unusual and unfamiliar design. The children, a boy and a girl, appeared malnourished and bewildered, seemingly lost in a world entirely foreign to them, and their most striking feature was undoubtedly the peculiar verdant hue of their complexion, a characteristic that gradually faded over the course of weeks as they consumed the food offered to them by the villagers who discovered them. The girl eventually learned to communicate in English and explained, in fragmented and often contradictory accounts, that they came from a place of perpetual twilight called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never fully rose, where the inhabitants existed in a state between day and night, and where they had somehow crossed into our reality through mechanisms neither they nor their observers could fully comprehend. The psychological mechanisms that may explain our continued fascination with this tale operate on multiple levels within human consciousness, for the unknown provenance of these children triggers our deepest curiosities about the boundaries of reality itself, the possibility of alternate worlds existing alongside our own, and the limitations of our understanding of geography and science. Yet despite the absence of any credible evidence, despite the lack of any rational explanation for how children with genuinely green skin could exist or where they could have originated, the legend persists in folklore and popular imagination, suggesting that humanity continues to. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trafia walked into the street and began to dance with frenzied, uncontrollable movements, her body convulsing to music that only she could hear. Within a week, 34 people had joined her in this compulsive dancing. Within a month, the number had grown to 300. These were not people performing for entertainment or engaging in religious ecstasy. They were individuals locked in a desperate, exhausting physical compulsion that caused their feet to bleed, their bodies to collapse from sheer fatigue, and several of them to dance until they simply died. Physicians gathered in the city, completely bewildered, searching frantically for explanations. Some suggested that the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus, a saint associated with dancing mania. Others proposed that the summer heat had driven them mad, or that ergot poisoning from contaminated grain had caused mass hallucinations and involuntary movement. The city authorities eventually banned music and dancing in the streets, believing that the rhythm itself was sustaining the affliction, yet the dancing continued regardless. The psychological mechanism at work here likely involved mass psychogenic illness, a condition where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a population via social observation and shared trauma. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city gripped by fear, famine, and disease, with residents living under constant threat of death. The dancing may have represented a physical manifestation of collective anxiety, a body speaking what the mind could not articulate. Yet what remains profoundly unsettling is how this event stands apart from our modern understanding of psychological phenomena, suggesting mechanisms we still cannot fully explain. On the night of June 11, 1962, three men, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence Anglin, executed what many consider one of the most audacious prison escapes in American history from the supposedly inescapable federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. For years, authorities maintained that the three men drowned in the frigid, treacherous waters surrounding the island, their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts that yielded no conclusive evidence of their fate. The men had spent months secretly engineering their escape by laboriously chiseling through cell walls using improvised tools, fashioning a raft from raincoats and materials gathered throughout the prison, and meticulously timing their departure to coincide with a blind spot in the guard rotation. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is that the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially closed its investigation in 1979 while maintaining the drowning theory. Yet credible evidence has periodically surfaced suggesting the men may have actually survived, including alleged sightings, letters supposedly written by Morris, and questions about the sufficiency of the official narrative to account for all observable facts. The psychological mechanism underlying our continued fascination with this case operates through the tension between institutional authority, the government's insistence on the drowning theory, and the tantalizing possibility that three ordinary men outsmarted one of the world's most secure facilities and vanished into new lives, a narrative that resonates deeply with our desire to believe that determined individuals can transcend systems designed to contain them. The mystery persists not because new evidence continuously emerges with equal weight, but because the absence of definitive proof allows both interpretations to coexist indefinitely in our collective consciousness, making ALC. In the early 1820s, a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale, allegedly buried an immense fortune somewhere in the mountains of Virginia, and before disappearing into obscurity, he left behind 3 encrypted messages that supposedly contained the location and details of this buried wealth. The story goes that Beale entrusted a hotel innkeeper named Robert Morris with a box containing these ciphers, instructing him not to open it for 10 years, after which time Beale would either retrieve it personally or send instructions on how to decode the mysterious documents. When Beale never returned, Morris eventually opened the box and discovered the 3 ciphered texts, which he spent years attempting to decrypt without success. The mystery deepened when Morris passed the documents to a friend named James Ward, who managed to decode the second cipher using the Declaration of Independence as a key, revealing tantalizing details about the treasure's contents and approximate location. However, the first and third ciphers remained stubbornly resistant to decryption despite countless attempts by cryptographers, amateur treasure hunters, and mathematical enthusiasts over nearly 200 years. The psychological appeal of the Beale ciphers rests upon the intoxicating combination of tangible historical documentation, verifiable encryption methods, and the persistent promise that fortune awaits those clever enough to solve the remaining puzzles. The fact that one cipher actually yielded to decryption efforts seemed to validate the entire premise and encourage generations of hopeful seekers to believe that patience, ingenuity, and the right key would eventually unlock the secrets of the other 2 messages. This mechanism transforms an otherwise dubious historical claim into something that feels scientifically plausible, leveraging our inherent desire to believe that hidden treasures exist and that we possess the intellectual capacity to disc. Nestled in the courtyard of the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, stands one of the most captivating and mysterious artworks ever created, a copper sculpture titled Cryptos, which was commissioned in 1988 and installed in 1990, measuring over 65 feet in length and featuring an undulating shape that suggests both a scroll and a topographic landscape, all while serving as an elaborate cryptographic puzzle that has entranced cryptographers, puzzle enthusiasts, and intelligence professionals for more than 3 decades. The sculpture was created by artist Jim Sanborn in collaboration with Edward Snowden, a cryptographer from the National Security Agency, and the entire work is embedded with encrypted messages hidden within 4 distinct cipher sections that were meticulously designed to be progressively more difficult to decode, creating a layered mystery that begins with relatively straightforward substitution ciphers and culminates in a final section that has resisted every serious decryption attempt despite the combined efforts of thousands of talented minds worldwide. The first 3 sections of Cryptos were eventually solved between 1998 and 2005, revealing haunting passages about the power of knowledge, the nature of shadow operations, and cryptography itself. Yet the 4th and final section, consisting of just 97 characters, has remained stubbornly impenetrable, leading to an almost obsessive global search for the solution and spawning countless theories, conferences, and collaborative efforts among cryptanalysts who become consumed by the challenge of unlocking its secrets. What makes Cryptos particularly fascinating is how the sculpture functions on multiple levels simultaneously, operating as public art installation, cryptographic challenge, and philosophical statement about secrecy and knowledge within the halls of an intel. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman cartographer and admiral named Piri Reis created a remarkable portal and chart that would eventually become one of history's most enigmatic and debated artifacts. This map, discovered in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in 1929, depicts the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and various other geographical features with a precision that seemed to defy the cartographic knowledge available during that era. The map itself is rendered on gazelle skin parchment and is only partially preserved, though scholars estimate it originally measured considerably larger before time claimed significant portions of its edges. What makes this artifact particularly intriguing is that it appears to show coastlines and geographical details that would not have been widely known to European cartographers until much later in the age of exploration, raising profound questions about the sources of Piri Reis's information and the extent of pre-Columbian or early post-Columbian knowledge about global geography. The human mind, when confronted with such apparent anachronisms, naturally seeks extraordinary explanations, and the Piri Reis map has consequently become the subject of increasingly fantastical interpretations involving lost advanced civilizations, extraterrestrial visitors, or secret pre-Columbian transoceanic voyages by unknown explorers. These speculative theories persist despite the existence of more plausible historical explanations, which suggest that Piri Reis synthesized information from various contemporary sources, including Portuguese charts, Columbus's own documentation, and Arabic geographical texts, all of which contained emerging knowledge about newly explored territories. The enduring fascination with this map exemplifies how historical ambiguity, combined with our deep psychological need to find meaning in puzzles, can transform a genuinely interesting artifact into a vase. Beneath the warm turquoise waters off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas lies a formation of massive stone blocks arranged in what appears to be a deliberate geometric pattern, stretching for approximately half a mile along the ocean floor. Discovered in 1968 by a pilot named Robert Brush, who spotted the unusual arrangement from above, this underwater structure has become one of the most debated archaeological mysteries of the modern era, captivating the imagination of researchers, treasure hunters, and believers in lost civilizations for more than 5 decades. The blocks themselves are composed of limestone and appear to measure between 3 and 9 feet in length, arranged in 2 parallel lines with what some observers interpret as connecting perpendicular sections, creating a formation that superficially resembles an ancient roadway or harbor construction. The depth at which these blocks rest, combined with the geological instability of the region, creates an enigmatic puzzle regarding their origin, purpose, and construction timeline. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistent fascination with Bimini Road centers on humanity's deep need to discover evidence of advanced lost civilizations and to connect contemporary anomalies with legendary stories, particularly the mythical account of Atlantis, which Edgar Cayce had allegedly predicted would be rediscovered in the Bahamas during the 1960s. When geological surveys and careful scientific analysis suggest that these formations are likely natural phenomena resulting from the fracturing and erosion of limestone bedrock over millennia, rather than human construction, the human mind often resists this mundane explanation in favor of more romantically compelling narratives about ancient engineers and submerged technological sophistication. Deep beneath the waters off the coast of Yonaguni, the southernmost island of Japan, lies a massive underwater rock formation that has captivated archaeologists, geologists, and mystery enthusiasts for decades. A structure so geometrically precise and seemingly intentional that it challenges our understanding of ancient human civilization and capability. Discovered in 1987 by a local diver named Kihikaro Aratake, the Yonaguni Monument stretches approximately 240 meters in length and extends approximately 100 meters from east to west, featuring remarkably flat surfaces, right angles, and what appear to be intentional cuts and terraces that descend in a staircase-like pattern toward the ocean floor. The formation sits at a depth of between 5 and 40 meters, making it accessible to experienced divers who have documented its features extensively over the past several decades, and what they found has generated intense debate within the scientific community. The monument displays characteristics that seem almost impossible to attribute to natural geological processes alone, including perfectly rectangular platforms, sharp 90-degree angles, and what appear to be deliberate carvings and channels running across its surfaces, leading some researchers to propose that ancient civilizations possessed far greater engineering capabilities than traditionally acknowledged. The psychological mechanism driving the mystery's persistence lies in humanity's tendency to recognize patterns and intentionality, a cognitive bias known as apophenia, where our brains automatically interpret ambiguous or random stimuli as meaningful structures and evidence of deliberate creation. And the striking geometric regularity of the Yonaguni Monument triggers this response powerfully. Deep in the mountains of southeastern Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, a site that fundamentally challenges everything archaeologists thought they understood about human civilization and social organization. Discovered in 1994, this archaeological wonder consists of massive stone towers and T-shaped pillars arranged in deliberate patterns, some weighing up to 16 tons, carved with intricate depictions of animals and abstract symbols, all constructed approximately 9,500 years before the pyramids of Egypt were built. What makes this discovery so profoundly puzzling is that these structures were erected by hunter-gatherer societies that supposedly lacked the organizational capacity, agricultural surplus, or centralized authority necessary to undertake such monumental construction projects. The conventional archaeological narrative insists that civilization itself, with its hierarchies and collective labor systems, could only emerge after agriculture was domesticated, yet Göbekli Tepe stands as undeniable evidence that sophisticated architectural achievement preceded farming by thousands of years. The builders of this site remain anonymous, their motivations shrouded in mystery, their organizational methods unknown, their spiritual or practical purposes lost to time. We cannot definitively determine whether this was a religious sanctuary, an astronomical observatory, a gathering place for ritual ceremonies, or something entirely outside our modern conceptual framework. The transition from the site's sudden abandonment around 9,000 years ago remains equally inexplicable, as if the people who invested tremendous effort in its construction simply decided to leave it behind, burying the structures deliberately beneath earthen mounds. On the remote volcanic island of Easter Island, thousands of miles from any continental landmass in the vast Pacific Ocean, archaeologists and linguists have discovered one of the most perplexing writing systems ever known to human civilization, a script called Rongorongo that appears on wooden tablets and artifacts dating back centuries, yet remains almost entirely undeciphered despite modern efforts involving artificial intelligence and computational linguistics. The script consists of hundreds of distinct glyphs carved into wooden surfaces using a technique that creates mirror image reversals of symbols, suggesting a form of boustrophedon writing where lines alternate in direction, much like plowing a field. And while researchers have identified approximately 1,600 individual characters or variations thereof, the fundamental meaning and underlying language structure continue to elude even our most sophisticated analytical methods. What makes Rongorongo particularly enigmatic is that it appears to have emerged independently on this isolated island without apparent influence from other known writing systems across the world. Yet by the time European explorers arrived in the 18th century, the knowledge of how to read and write this script had almost completely vanished from the island's population, leaving only fragments of oral tradition and scattered wooden tablets as our sole window into this lost linguistic world. The psychological mechanism that draws us toward this mystery lies in our fundamental human need to decipher and understand written communication, as writing itself represents one of our species' greatest achievements, and encountering a writing system that refuses to surrender its secrets activates something primal within us, a compulsion to solve the unsolvable riddle. Deep within the archaeological record of the ancient Minoan civilization, which flourished on the island of Crete between roughly 3000 and 1400 BCE, there exists a writing system that remains almost entirely impenetrable to modern scholars and linguists despite more than a century of intensive study and decipherment efforts. This script, known as Linear A, represents one of the oldest European writing systems ever discovered, predating even the famous Linear B script by several centuries, and yet it refuses to yield its secrets to our contemporary methods of analysis and interpretation. Thousands of inscriptions have been found on clay tablets, pottery, religious artifacts, and architectural remains scattered across Minoan sites, presenting us with tantalizing glimpses of an advanced civilization whose words and thoughts remain locked behind an undeciphered linguistic barrier that seems almost intentionally resistant to understanding. The fundamental psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep human need to decode and comprehend the communications of ancient peoples, a compulsion rooted in our desire to establish continuity with the past and to believe that all human expression can eventually be translated and understood through sufficient effort and expertise. The existence of Linear A creates a peculiar intellectual frustration because we possess the texts themselves, we can see the symbols clearly, and we can even sometimes guess at their approximate meanings through contextual clues and comparisons with related writing systems, yet the complete language structure remains obstinately hidden from us. What makes this mystery persist so stubbornly is the unfortunate absence of a Rosetta Stone equivalent for Linear A. Unlike its younger cousin Linear B, which was eventually decoded through methodical linguistic analysis and comparative study with known Greek dialects. Approximately 5,000 years ago, across the sprawling river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a sophisticated civilization flourished with remarkable urban planning, standardized weights and measures, and an intricate system of written communication that remains entirely undeciphered to this day. The Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, left behind thousands of artifacts bearing short inscriptions in a script composed of several hundred distinct symbols, each seemingly representing either phonetic sounds or complete concepts, yet their true meaning has eluded even the most brilliant cryptographers and linguists of the modern era. These inscriptions appear primarily on small seals, pottery, and copper tablets, often accompanied by carefully crafted pictorial representations of animals and abstract geometric patterns, suggesting a writing system of considerable complexity and purposeful design. The script appears to have been used for trade, identification, religious purposes, and possibly administrative record-keeping, given its prevalence in what scholars believe were marketplaces and urban centers. However, without any known translation key, no comparable bilingual texts from contemporary civilizations, and no surviving linguistic descendants that might provide interpretive guidance, researchers have found themselves perpetually unable to unlock the underlying language or cultural meaning embedded within these ancient symbols. The fundamental mystery persists because the Indus civilization itself remains enigmatic. We do not definitively know what language these people spoke, whether the script represents a single language or multiple languages, or whether the symbols operated as a logographic system similar to Chinese characters or as an alphabetic system like later Semitic scripts. In the depths of the Baltic Sea, approximately 85 kilometers off the coast of Sweden, sits one of the ocean's most perplexing discoveries, a massive underwater formation that has captivated researchers, skeptics, and the public imagination for nearly 2 decades. In 2003, Swedish treasure hunters operating a deep-sea salvage company were conducting a routine sonar scan of the seafloor when their equipment detected an enormous circular object, roughly 60 meters in diameter, resting on the bottom at a depth of nearly 90 meters, an anomaly that defied immediate explanation and would soon inspire countless theories. What followed was a slow accumulation of intrigue as images and data emerged, showing what appeared to be a perfectly geometric dome-shaped structure, complete with what looked like a shaft or spire protruding from its surface, characteristics that seemed far too deliberate and organized to be merely a natural geological formation. The structure's symmetry and apparent construction suggested intelligent design, leading some to theorize everything from ancient extraterrestrial visitation to classified military installations lost to the sea, hypotheses that captured global attention and spawned numerous documentaries and sensational media accounts. As scientific examination continued, however, a more mundane reality began to emerge, one grounded in geological principles and oceanographic phenomena that, while fascinating in their own right, proved considerably less mysterious than the initial speculation had promised. Researchers eventually determined that the anomaly was likely a glacial deposit, a composition of sedimentary rock and mineral formations that had accumulated over thousands of years, combined with natural geological processes and the specific patterns that sonar equipment can produce when scanning unfamiliar underwater terrain, creating visual artifacts that suggested structure and intention. Somewhere in the depths of the Bastille prison in 17th-century France, a mysterious prisoner was allegedly held in complete isolation, forced to wear an iron mask to conceal his identity from the world, a figure so secret that even the guards who maintained his cell were sworn to absolute silence about his existence and appearance. Historical records confirm that a prisoner matching this description was indeed incarcerated, transferred between various fortresses including the Bastille, the Isle of Sainte Marguerite, and the Bastille again, spending decades in captivity under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Yet the true identity of this masked figure has never been definitively established despite centuries of investigation and speculation. The psychological mechanism behind this mystery operates through the human compulsion to assign meaning and narrative to genuine historical gaps. When we encounter a real event shrouded in legitimate historical obscurity, our minds automatically construct plausible explanations, transforming genuine administrative secrecy into romantic possibilities such as illegitimate royal children, displaced heirs to thrones, or dangerous political threats. The mask itself became the central symbol of this mystery, captivating imaginations across generations because it represents the ultimate erasure of identity and the absolute power of a state to disappear someone from history, making the unknown prisoner seem more significant and mysterious than he perhaps actually was. What makes this mystery persist despite reasonable historical analysis is our cultural fascination with hidden truths within institutional power structures, and our desire for the extraordinary to lurk beneath the mundane, transforming what may have been a routine case of political imprisonment into an enduring legend that has inspired countless literary works, theatrical productions, and films that have cemented the man in iron mask into pop. In the spring of 1828, a disheveled teenage boy appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, seemingly unable to speak coherently or walk normally, carrying only a letter addressed to a cavalry officer and claiming to have spent his entire life locked in a dark cell with minimal human contact. This boy, who would become known as Kaspar Hauser, presented one of the 19th century's most bewildering psychological and genealogical puzzles, as his true origins, his actual time in captivity, and the circumstances of his confinement remained shrouded in profound mystery that endures to this very day. Witnesses described a youth who appeared to have been raised in complete isolation, exhibiting behaviors consistent with severe developmental deprivation. Yet the identity of his parents, his captors, and the true duration of his imprisonment became the subject of intense speculation and competing theories that divided scholars, physicians, and investigative authorities for generations. Some researchers proposed that Kaspar was the illegitimate or unwanted heir to a European noble family, held prisoner to prevent claims to a valuable inheritance or to conceal a scandal within the aristocracy, while others suggested he was simply a disturbed impostor fabricating an elaborate story for attention and sympathy. The psychological mechanism at work seems rooted in the fundamental human desire to uncover hidden truths and impose coherent narratives upon chaotic circumstances, compelling observers to construct elaborate explanations where insufficient evidence exists. Despite numerous investigations, examinations by medical professionals, and attempts to trace his origins through documentation and testimony, no conclusive proof of Kaspar Hauser's identity ever emerged, and the case became increasingly difficult to resolve as key witnesses died and memories faded over time. Standing in the rural landscape of Elbert County, Georgia, there exists a remarkable monument known as the Georgia Guidestones, a granite structure that has captivated conspiracy theorists and curious minds since its mysterious construction in 1980. The monument consists of 4 massive granite slabs arranged in a cross pattern, topped with a capstone, and rising nearly 17 feet into the air, constructed with such precision that it aligns with celestial bodies, and contains messages inscribed in multiple languages including English, Spanish, Swahili, Russian, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and Hindi. The inscriptions outline 10 principles for a future civilization, beginning with the suggestion to maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature, followed by statements about guided reproduction, unity, passion, truth, justice, rights and responsibilities, and the importance of leaving room for nature. What makes this monument profoundly enigmatic is that the identity of the person or group who commissioned and funded its construction has remained completely unknown, protected by anonymity through the use of intermediaries and pseudonyms, with only a small group of local bankers and officials who arranged the transaction possessing any real knowledge of the true creator's identity. The psychological mechanism that has sustained interest in this mystery for over 4 decades stems from humanity's instinctive response to purposeful anonymity combined with the unsettling implications of the monument's message itself, which reads like a blueprint from an unknown authority figure advocating for global population reduction, thereby triggering both apocalyptic and utopian interpretations depending on one's perspective and ideological framework. In January of 2011, an anonymous image began appearing on the internet image board 4chan, displaying nothing more than the text, "Hello. We are looking for highly intelligent individuals," alongside an obscure illustration of a cicada insect rendered in stark black and white. This cryptic message launched what would become one of the most elaborate and bewildering puzzles ever constructed on the internet, attracting thousands of participants from across the globe into an increasingly complex web of codes, ciphers, coordinates, and interconnected challenges that seem to demand expertise in mathematics, computer science, cryptography, and obscure historical knowledge. The mysterious organization or individual behind Cicada 3301 released increasingly intricate puzzles that incorporated steganography, prime numbers, geographical coordinates that led to physical locations in the real world where participants would discover additional clues. and references to literature, philosophy, and obscure internet lore that suggested whoever created this had invested extraordinary resources into its construction. The psychological mechanism driving the phenomenon stemmed from humanity's deep fascination with secrets, codes, and the promise of membership in an exclusive group of individuals recognized for their intellectual superiority, tapping into primal desires to feel special and to solve mysteries that others cannot, while the Internet's anonymous nature allowed participants to engage without social consequence. Cicada 3301 reappeared in subsequent years with new iterations of puzzles, each more complex than the last, yet despite genuine investigative work by thousands of intelligent people, the true identity and purpose of Cicada 3301 has never been conclusively determined, leaving us in a state of perpetual uncertainty where the mystery itself has become more culturally significant than any potential answer could ever be. On November 11, 1987, television viewers across Chicago experienced something that would become one of the most peculiar and unexplained broadcasts in the history of American television, an incident so strange that it has never been fully solved despite decades of investigation. During the evening news broadcast on WGN-TV, the regular programming was suddenly interrupted by a figure wearing a shiny silver suit and an oversized rubber mask depicting a computerized face with exaggerated features, blinking eyes, and an unsettling grin, a character known as Max Headroom that had been popular in advertising and entertainment at the time. The masked figure appeared on screen for approximately 20 seconds, moving in jerky, robotic motions while making strange noises, saying nothing coherent, simply staring directly into the camera with an expression of disturbing blankness before the broadcast cut to black. What makes this incident particularly mysterious is that later that same evening, the intruder or intruders managed to interrupt an entire television broadcast on WTTW, another major Chicago station, for a full 2 minutes, during which the Max Headroom figure reappeared, this time sitting in what appeared to be a television control room set. Gyrating inappropriately and making bizarre comments about being on television while a spanking sound effect played repeatedly in the background. The sheer technical sophistication required to hijack broadcast signals from 2 separate television stations within hours of each other suggested someone with considerable knowledge of broadcast engineering and television transmission systems, yet the perpetrator or perpetrators were never identified. Despite extensive investigations by the Federal Communications Commission and law enforcement agencies, with numerous theories and suspects proposed over the years, the true identity of whoever orchestrated these hijackings remains unknown. Deep within the Russian shoreline, somewhere along the waters of the Arctic, there exists a radio transmission that has been broadcasting continuously since 1974, sending out a monotonous buzzing sound at 4 times per second, a rhythmic pulse that has become one of the most enigmatic and unsettling phenomena in modern telecommunications history. The signal itself occupies the frequency of 4.625 MHz, and it transmits almost exclusively a buzzing tone that Western observers began calling the buzzer during the Cold War era, when military enthusiasts and shortwave radio hobbyists first documented its existence and began attempting to decode its mysterious purpose. Occasionally, this perpetual droning sound is interrupted by brief messages spoken in Russian, typically consisting of numbers, names, or geographical locations, delivered in a calm, emotionless voice before the buzzing resumes its endless cycle. And these rare interjections have sparked countless theories about the station's true function and intended audience. Researchers and independent investigators have speculated that UVB-76 might function as a dead man's switch, a failsafe mechanism designed to continue broadcasting indefinitely, only stopping if a specific code or signal is transmitted from a central authority, suggesting its purpose relates to military command and control during nuclear emergencies or catastrophic scenarios. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this phenomenon stems from the inherent human discomfort with the unknown and our instinctive need to assign meaning to patterns and signals, particularly those connected to military institutions and potential existential threats. And the isolation of the signal combined with its cryptic nature creates an aura of mystery that captures our imagination. Throughout the 20th century and continuing into the present day, radio enthusiasts and shortwave listeners have documented a peculiar and deeply unsettling phenomenon that remains unexplained. The existence of numbers stations, mysterious broadcasts that transmit nothing but sequences of numbers, often read in monotone voices across international frequencies at seemingly random intervals. These stations emerge without warning on shortwave bands, typically featuring a woman or man reciting endless strings of digits, sometimes in English, sometimes in other languages, occasionally interspersed with musical interludes or coded phrases that appear meaningless to the untrained ear. The broadcasts have been monitored consistently since at least the 1950s, with documented recordings and listener accounts spanning decades. Yet their purpose, origin, and operational infrastructure remain officially unconfirmed by any government or international body. Intelligence analysts and cryptography experts have long theorized that these stations serve as communication channels for espionage networks, allowing intelligence agencies to transmit encrypted messages to field operatives in foreign territories through a method so simple and so widespread that it becomes nearly impossible to intercept with certainty. The numbers themselves, when arranged according to predetermined codebooks known only to the intended recipients, could theoretically convey complex instructions, intelligence reports, or classified information without drawing attention from casual listeners who would hear only monotonous numerical sequences. What makes this phenomenon psychologically compelling is the deliberate obfuscation inherent in its design. By encoding vital information within something so mundane and meaningless sounding that it repels casual interest, the stations achieve a form of security through sheer indifference. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, situated high in the desert landscape at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet, residents began reporting a persistent, low-frequency humming sound sometime in the early 1990s, a phenomenon that would come to perplex scientists, frustrate residents, and generate theories ranging from the mundane to the extraordinarily implausible. The sound itself, described by those who claim to hear it as a faint but unmistakable hum, typically resonates at a frequency around 17 Hz, a range that sits just below the threshold of normal human hearing, manifesting more as a felt vibration in the chest and bones rather than an auditory experience processed through the ears. Hundreds of residents reported hearing the noise, particularly in the evenings and at night, describing it as mechanical, otherworldly, and profoundly unsettling, a constant reminder that something in their environment was fundamentally wrong in ways they could not quite understand or articulate. Scientists dispatched to investigate the phenomenon measured sound levels extensively throughout the town, interviewed residents thoroughly, and examined every potential source from power lines to distant highways. Yet remarkably, their instruments could detect nothing conclusively matching the descriptions offered by those who experienced it directly. The psychological mechanism at work in the Taos Hum involves the power of suggestion and expectation to shape perception, where knowledge that others nearby are hearing something creates a framework through which random or threshold-level environmental stimuli can be interpreted as meaningful, transformed into evidence of a real phenomenon when the mind has been primed to search for exactly such a thing. In the remote Hesdalen Valley of Norway, nestled between steep mountains in the Trondelag region, a phenomenon has captivated observers for decades with its inexplicable light displays that dance across the night sky with seemingly intelligent purpose. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing sporadically to the present day, witnesses have reported extraordinary luminous objects moving through the valley in patterns that defy conventional explanation, exhibiting accelerations and directional changes that appear to violate the laws of physics as we understand them. Lights vary dramatically in color, ranging from brilliant white to deep red to mysterious blue-green hues, and they move with velocities that would render them invisible to conventional aircraft, yet they display an uncanny awareness of observers below. These phenomena occur frequently enough that the location has become a destination for researchers, astronomers, and curious enthusiasts who camp in the valley with cameras and instruments hoping to capture documentation of these extraordinary events. The scientific community has proposed numerous explanations ranging from electrical phenomena in the atmosphere to ball lightning to exotic plasma formations. Yet none of these theories fully account for the observed behavior and intelligence seemingly displayed by the movements. What makes the Hesdalen lights particularly intriguing is how the phenomenon has persisted despite intense scrutiny and investigation, with research stations erected specifically to monitor the valley and yet the lights continue to perform their mysterious displays, largely immune to understanding. The acceptance of these lights as a genuine phenomenon without adequate explanation reveals how mysteries can exist even in modern times with full scientific apparatus available, reminding us that the universe still contains phenomena that challenge our frameworks of understanding, and that the most ordinary. On the evening of March 13, 1997, thousands of residents across Arizona witnessed an extraordinary phenomenon that would become one of the most credible and widely documented UFO sightings in modern history. The event began around 8 o'clock when witnesses reported seeing an enormous triangular or V-shaped object silently gliding across the night sky, stretching nearly a mile in width according to many accounts, and moving slowly and deliberately from the north to the south across the Phoenix metropolitan area and beyond. The craft appeared to be so massive that it blotted out stars as it passed overhead, and multiple witnesses, including pilots, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens from various locations, independently corroborated the sighting with similar descriptions of the object's shape, size, and behavior. Later that evening, around 10 o'clock, bright orbs of light appeared in the sky above the Phoenix area, hovering silently and displaying unusual characteristics that defied conventional explanation, leading to widespread speculation and confusion about their origin and nature. The incident generated such overwhelming public interest and concern that the United States Air Force eventually held a press conference, attributing the sightings to flares from military exercises, an explanation that satisfied few observers given the stark differences between the reported phenomena and conventional flares. What remains psychologically compelling about the Phoenix Lights is the sheer density of credible witnesses, the corroboration of details across independent accounts, and the fundamental challenge it posed to the prevailing narratives about what could possibly exist in our skies. The human mind naturally seeks rational explanations for unexplained phenomena, and when those explanations prove inadequate or unconvincing, a lingering uncertainty settles in, creating a persistent cognitive discomfort that resists easy resolution. In December of 1980, near the Royal Air Force Base at Rendlesham in Suffolk, England, military personnel reported witnessing unexplained aerial phenomena that would become one of the most credible UFO sightings in modern history. Over the course of 3 nights, beginning on December 26th, trained observers including Deputy Base Commander Colonel Charles Halt documented what they described as a structured craft with extraordinary capabilities, moving through the forest with apparent intelligence and demonstrating flight characteristics that defied conventional explanation. The witnesses were not civilians prone to hysteria or misinterpretation, but disciplined military officers trained to observe and report accurately, men whose careers depended upon credibility and whose testimony carried weight that ordinary accounts could not match. They reported intense beams of light penetrating the forest canopy, electromagnetic interference affecting their equipment, and a craft that seemed to possess capabilities far beyond any aircraft known to exist at that time, including the ability to hover silently and accelerate to impossible speeds. The psychological mechanism that allows the Rendlesham Forest incident to persist as an enduring mystery, despite decades of investigation and official inquiries, stems from the fundamental conflict between the extraordinary nature of the claims and the impeccable nature of those making them. When credible witnesses describe incredible things, we face a cognitive dissonance that our minds struggle to resolve, because accepting their accounts would require accepting possibilities we have collectively decided do not exist, yet dismissing them seems to deny the very concept of reliability itself. On the evening of October 21, 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport in his single-engine Cessna, bound for King Island with a journey that should have taken approximately 1 hour. Yet what transpired during those final minutes of radio contact would become one of aviation's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. During his flight, Valentich reported to air traffic control that he was being followed by an unidentified aircraft that he described as appearing metallic and moving at tremendous speed, seemingly keeping pace with his small plane despite his attempts to maneuver away from it, and his final radio transmission contained his increasingly anxious voice stating that the other aircraft was now directly above him, before the signal cut out entirely, leaving only static and an eerie silence that has endured for over 4 decades. Neither Valentich nor his aircraft were ever found, despite extensive search and rescue operations that combed the waters around the Bass Strait, and no wreckage, no debris, and no trace of either the pilot or the plane ever surfaced to provide any concrete explanation for what occurred that night. The mystery deepens when considering that multiple witnesses on the ground reported seeing unusual lights in the sky around the same time and location, lending credence to Valentich's account of something extraordinary happening above the waters. Yet the absence of any physical evidence has allowed skeptics to suggest alternative explanations ranging from pilot disorientation leading to a fatal dive into the ocean, to instrument malfunction, to psychological episodes that might have caused him to imagine the pursuing aircraft. What makes the Valentich disappearance so psychologically compelling is precisely this ambiguity, because the case exists in an uncomfortable space between the explicable and the impossible, where rational X. In the autumn of 1966, the small industrial town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, became the epicenter of one of America's most perplexing cryptozoological phenomena when multiple witnesses reported encounters with a towering, winged humanoid creature that came to be known as the Mothman. The initial sighting occurred on November 15th when two young couples reported seeing a gray, man-shaped being with an enormous wingspan and hypnotic red eyes near an abandoned TNT plant on the outskirts of town. And within days, dozens of additional reports flooded in from credible witnesses, including businessmen, construction workers, and even law enforcement officers who described an entity standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, with wings folded against its back and eyes that glowed crimson in the darkness. Over the following 13 months, more than 100 documented sightings occurred throughout the region, with witnesses describing consistent physical characteristics and an inexplicable ability to keep pace with automobiles traveling at high speeds, leading to widespread fear and media attention that transformed the quiet Appalachian community into a paranormal hotspot. The psychological mechanism underlying such mass sightings likely involves a combination of misidentification of known animals, such as sandhill cranes or barn owls, which possess wingspans and visual characteristics that could appear otherworldly in low-light conditions or from a distance, coupled with the powerful human tendency toward pattern recognition and confirmation bias, wherein initial reports prime subsequent observers to interpret ambiguous stimuli through the lens of the existing narrative. The phenomenon also exploited a community psychology of fear and uncertainty, as Point Pleasant was experiencing economic decline and social anxiety during this period, creating fertile psychological ground for shared extraordinary experiences to gain traction. On the 12th of December in the year 1918, the steamship Archtor passed by the Flannan Isles, a remote cluster of rocky islands situated roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, and the crew noticed something profoundly unsettling about the lighthouse that stood upon those barren rocks. The light, which should have been shining brightly to guide vessels safely through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, was completely dark and extinguished. When a relief crew was finally dispatched to investigate this alarming circumstance, they discovered that all 3 lighthouse keepers who had been stationed there, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, had vanished without trace, leaving behind a mystery that would captivate and confound investigators for more than a century to come. The lighthouse itself appeared remarkably undisturbed, with meals partially prepared on tables, beds still unmade, personal belongings neatly arranged, and no signs of struggle or violence evident anywhere within the structure. The logbook entries ceased abruptly on the 9th of December, offering no explanation for what had transpired in those final days. Some speculated that a sudden, catastrophic wave must have swept the men away while they worked outside maintaining the exterior equipment and lantern room, while others proposed that a violent storm combined with isolation and psychological strain might have driven one or more of the keepers to madness and murder. Yet the evidence supporting these theories remains frustratingly incomplete and circumstantial. The mystery endures precisely because the physical facts refuse to align neatly with any single narrative, and despite more than a century of speculation, investigation, and historical examination, the true fate of those 3 men remains locked away in time, transforming the Flannan Isles lighthouse into one of the most haunted. In February of 1948, the Dutch cargo ship SS Ourang Medan was traversing the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia when crew members aboard nearby vessels received a series of distress signals that would become one of maritime history's most perplexing disappearances. The initial radio transmission reportedly came through in Morse code, containing a message of profound despair, with the operator stating that the captain and most of the crew had died suddenly and that something was terribly wrong aboard the vessel, yet providing no explanation for the catastrophe unfolding on deck. When rescue ships finally located the Ourang Medan, they discovered a scene of inexplicable horror, with every crew member found dead in grotesque positions, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony, their bodies seemingly unmarked by any visible injury or disease, scattered across different sections of the ship in what appeared to be the aftermath of a mass panic rather than a coordinated event. The rescue crews, deeply unnerved by what they were witnessing, reportedly attempted to salvage the vessel, but before they could secure it, the ship suddenly caught fire and sank beneath the surface, taking with it whatever physical evidence might have explained the tragedy. The mechanism that likely sustains this mystery across decades stems from the ship's vanishing into the sea, which eliminated the possibility of thorough investigation and autopsy, allowing speculation and folklore to fill the void left by lost evidence. Without the tangible wreckage or preserved bodies for medical examination, theories have proliferated ranging from toxic gas exposure and disease to supernatural intervention, each gaining credence in the absence of contradictory data. In January of 1921, the American merchant vessel Carroll A was discovered stranded on the Diamond Shoals off the coast of North Carolina, abandoned completely and without explanation, floating as a ghostly hull upon the dark Atlantic waters. The ship had departed from the port of Barbados carrying a cargo of general merchandise and maintained regular communication with passing vessels until it reached the waters near Cape Hatteras, where all contact ceased abruptly and mysteriously. When Coast Guard personnel boarded the vessel to investigate its condition, they found the ship entirely deserted with no crew members present, though evidence suggested the abandonment had occurred only hours before discovery, as food remained warm in the galley and the captain's log and navigational instruments had vanished entirely. Circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the crew remain utterly perplexing, because the ship itself showed no signs of distress or damage that would account for such a sudden evacuation, and no bodies were ever recovered from the surrounding waters to indicate foul play or disaster. Maritime experts have proposed numerous theories ranging from pirate attack to mutiny to an encounter with a German submarine, yet none of these explanations find solid evidentiary support in the historical record. The psychological mechanism underlying this mystery appears rooted in our deep human need to construct logical narratives from fragmentary information, compelling us to fill gaps in knowledge with speculation and assumption rather than accepting genuine uncertainty. We continue to theorize and debate the fate of the Carroll A. Deering's crew across more than a century because the alternative, that some events remain fundamentally inexplicable despite our investigative efforts, creates profound cognitive dissonance in our minds. In November of 1809, a British diplomat named Benjamin Bathurst vanished without trace from a coaching inn in the small Austrian town of Perleberg, leaving behind one of the most perplexing enigmas of the 19th century that continues to baffle historians and researchers to this day. Bathurst had been returning to England from Vienna, where he had served as a diplomat, and he stopped at the White Swan Inn to rest his horses and refresh himself during his journey through Prussian territory, which was then occupied by French forces under Napoleon's command. According to the accounts of those present that evening, Bathurst stepped outside the inn around 10:30 in the evening to inspect his traveling carriage, and when several minutes had passed without his return, members of his party went to search for him only to discover that he had utterly vanished from the courtyard, leaving no trace of his departure, no signs of struggle, and no explanation for his sudden absence. The mystery deepens when one considers the circumstances surrounding his disappearance, for the courtyard was enclosed by walls and gates, his carriage remained untouched, and no one had witnessed him leaving the premises, yet extensive searches of the surrounding countryside, conducted with the cooperation of local authorities, yielded absolutely nothing. The psychological mechanism behind our fascination with cases such as Bathurst's disappearance lies in our profound human need to impose order and causality upon the world around us. And when confronted with a situation where a person simply ceases to exist with no logical explanation, our minds struggle against the randomness and chaos that such an occurrence represents. We instinctively search for alternative narratives that might impose meaning upon the event, whether through theories of kidnapping by French agents, voluntary desertion, or even supernatural intervention, because nestled within the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, Russia, there once existed one of the most extraordinary artistic treasures of the 18th century. The Amber Room, a chamber of breathtaking beauty, constructed almost entirely from carved amber panels, mirrors, and gold leaf, that glowed with a warm, honeyed luminescence that seemed to capture and transform light itself into something almost otherworldly and transcendent. Created over a decade by German craftsmen and gifted to the Russian Tsars in 1716, this masterpiece of Baroque craftsmanship stood as a testament to human artistry and the wealth of empires, occupying an entire room whose walls seemed to shimmer and shift with every subtle change in illumination. During the Second World War, when Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union and occupied the region surrounding Leningrad, German soldiers carefully dismantled the Amber Room piece by intricate piece, crating its components and transporting them to the city of Königsberg in East Prussia, where it was reassembled within the castle there as a prize of conquest. However, as the war turned and Soviet forces advanced westward, the fate of this irreplaceable treasure became shrouded in mystery and contradictory accounts, with some witnesses claiming it was destroyed in the bombing of Königsberg in 1945, while others insisted it was hidden away in underground bunkers or secret locations that remain undiscovered to this day. The psychological mechanism underlying this enduring mystery seems rooted in the simple fact that the Amber Room represented something impossible to replace, a unique creation whose loss constituted an irretrievable cultural catastrophe, and thus the human mind struggled and continues to struggle with the finality of such destruction, instead entertaining possibilities of recovery that may or may not bear any relation to historical reality. Between 1884 and 1917, the Russian jeweler Carl Fabergé created 50 imperial Easter eggs for the Russian royal family, each one a masterpiece of intricate craftsmanship containing hidden mechanical surprises and precious materials including gold, enamel, diamonds, and pearls. Today, only 43 of these extraordinary objects are accounted for, leaving 7 eggs lost to history in a manner that seems almost impossible given their immense value and cultural significance. Yet their disappearance remains one of the most persistent mysteries in the world of decorative arts. The eggs vanished during the tumultuous period of the Russian Revolution when the Romanov family was executed, and their vast collections were seized, scattered, and dispersed across the world, with many treasures sold or smuggled out by desperate nobles and Bolshevik officials alike. The psychological mechanism driving the search for these missing eggs lies in the human compulsion to complete collections, a deeply rooted instinct that makes incompleteness feel like an unresolved tension in the narrative of cultural heritage, transforming each lost object into a ghost that haunts historians and collectors with questions about what happened during those chaotic years. Despite decades of exhaustive research, auction house investigations, and international collaboration among curators and specialists, the 7 missing eggs have never surfaced in any documented collection, museum, or private holding, yet the search continues unabated because people cannot accept that something so deliberately crafted, so materially substantial, and so historically significant could simply vanish without explanation. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is how we have normalized the incompleteness, incorporating the absence itself into the mythology of these eggs, treating them as legendary artifacts rather than simply lost objects, and in doing so, among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the Qumran caves between 1947 and 1956 lies one artifact of extraordinary peculiarity, a scroll constructed not from the fragile parchment or papyrus that characterize other ancient documents, but from hammered sheets of pure copper, a material so unusual for manuscript preservation that its very existence raises profound questions about the intentions of those who created it. This copper scroll, dating to sometime between the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, contains an extensive inventory of treasures written in a form of Hebrew that proved so difficult to decipher that scholars could not fully read its contents until 1956, when the scroll was carefully cut into strips to reveal the text without destroying the brittle metal. The list that emerged described approximately 60 locations throughout the Judean wilderness where treasures of gold, silver, and other valuables were allegedly hidden, quantities so vast that, if accurate, they would constitute one of the greatest hoards of precious metals ever assembled. The psychological mechanism that has sustained interest in the Copper Scroll for over 70 years stems from the tantalizing combination of specificity and inaccessibility. For while the document provides detailed descriptions of hiding places with measurements and directional landmarks, virtually none of these treasures have ever been recovered despite numerous organized searches and expeditions by both amateur treasure hunters and professional archaeologists. This paradox creates a compelling narrative tension wherein the very concreteness of the document's claims makes their apparent falsity or irretrievability all the more frustrating. And this frustration has normalized the Copper Scroll as perhaps history's most elaborate hoax, or perhaps history's greatest unsolved treasure map, a status that ensures its continued pause. During the final years of World War II, as Japanese forces faced inevitable defeat across the Pacific Theater, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the commanding officer of Japanese military operations in the Philippines, allegedly orchestrated the looting and burial of enormous quantities of gold, silver, gems, and other precious treasures throughout the Philippine Islands. According to historical accounts and numerous testimonies from soldiers and treasure hunters, this wealth was systematically pillaged from conquered territories across Southeast Asia and deliberately hidden in underground vaults and secret locations, creating what has become known as Yamashita's gold or the Yamashita treasure. The estimated value of this buried wealth ranges wildly from hundreds of millions to several $1 trillion in modern currency, making it potentially the largest hidden treasure in human history. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is that substantial evidence exists supporting some version of these events, including declassified military documents, eyewitness accounts from Japanese officers and soldiers, photographs of burial sites, and actual discoveries of gold caches in various locations throughout the Philippines that match descriptions from historical records. Yet despite decades of intensive searching, countless expeditions, and significant financial investments in recovery efforts, no verified large-scale discovery of Yamashita's gold has ever been confirmed through legitimate archaeological or governmental channels. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistent belief in Yamashita's gold relates to how history functions as narrative, how wartime chaos creates information vacuums that speculation fills, and how the combination of documented evidence fragments with plausible-sounding accounts creates a compelling sense of hidden truth. In the final days of World War II, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied forces closing in from all directions, rumors began to circulate among Polish citizens and occupying Soviet troops of a mysterious armored train allegedly laden with Nazi treasure, vanishing somewhere in the mountainous borderlands between Poland and Czechoslovakia. The legend described an extraordinary conveyance reportedly containing gold bars, precious jewels, artwork, and currency looted from across occupied Europe, a final desperate attempt by Nazi officials to preserve their accumulated wealth as their empire crumbled into ash and ruin. For decades, treasure hunters, historians, and adventurers have combed through historical records and conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys across vast stretches of Polish countryside, each new search accompanied by fresh testimonies from alleged eyewitnesses and cryptic wartime documents. Yet no concrete evidence of such a train has ever been definitively located or authenticated by mainstream scholarship. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent mystery appears rooted in humanity's deep fascination with hidden treasures and lost civilizations, a narrative that satisfies our desire to believe that monumental historical events contain untold secrets waiting beneath the surface for someone clever or fortunate enough to uncover them. The Nazi gold train represents a perfect storm of historical intrigue, combining the dramatic collapse of a major world power, the documented reality of Nazi looting operations, and the tantalizing possibility that some portion of their ill-gotten gains might still lie hidden and recoverable, creating an irresistible allure that transcends rational skepticism. Despite the absence of verified physical evidence and the questionable reliability of many supposed eyewitness accounts that emerged decades after the supposed events, the legend persists in popular culture and REM. In the 1920s and 1930s, excavations at Zhaokudian near Beijing uncovered a series of remarkable fossil remains belonging to Homo erectus, a hominin species that lived approximately 400,000 to 700,000 years ago, and these discoveries became known throughout the scientific world as Peking Man, representing some of the most significant evidence of early human evolution and tool use in Asia. The fossils included skull fragments, teeth, jaw bones, and various skeletal elements that provided unprecedented insight into the morphology and behavior of our ancient ancestors, suggesting they possessed the cognitive capacity to create and use stone tools, hunt large game, and potentially control fire, fundamentally changing our understanding of human development and migration patterns across the Eurasian continent. However, during the Japanese occupation of China in World War II, the original fossil collection mysteriously disappeared, vanishing from a museum in Beijing during the chaos of wartime, and despite extensive searches, diplomatic negotiations, and historical investigations spanning decades, the actual location of these invaluable specimens has never been definitively established, leaving only casts, photographs, and descriptions in scientific literature as evidence of their existence. The psychological weight of this loss has created an unusual paradox within paleontology, wherein the Peking Man remains have become simultaneously more and less significant to our understanding of human origins, because while their physical absence prevents direct modern analysis using advanced genetic and isotopic techniques that could reveal extraordinary details about diet, migration, and evolution. The documented research conducted before their disappearance established findings so influential and well recorded that they continue shaping anthropological discourse and remain central to textbooks despite the impossibility of very. One of history's most enigmatic losses remains the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, that legendary repository of ancient knowledge which held within its walls the accumulated wisdom of the Mediterranean world and beyond. Yet the precise circumstances of its demise have eluded historians for nearly 2,000 years, spawning competing narratives and theories that continue to shift with each new examination of historical evidence. The library, established during the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt around the 3rd century BCE, was said to contain somewhere between 400,000 and 7 million scrolls, though historians cannot agree on the exact figure, and served as humanity's greatest intellectual archive until its gradual and mysterious decline occurred across several centuries rather than in a single catastrophic event. Multiple destruction accounts have been proposed by scholars. Some point to Julius Caesar's military campaigns in Alexandria during 48 BCE when fires allegedly consumed the harbor district. Others suggest the religious fervor of early Christian leaders seeking to eliminate pagan knowledge. Still others blame the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE. And perhaps most troublingly, no single historical source definitively documents a complete destruction, forcing researchers to piece together fragmentary accounts from scattered ancient texts. The psychological mechanism underlying this mystery involves our deep human need to identify a clear villain and a singular moment of loss, a narrative structure that our minds find satisfying and memorable, yet the reality appears far messier and more ambiguous, suggesting instead a slow erosion through neglect, funding cuts, political upheaval, and the natural decay of materials across generations. Among the vast expanse of Roman military history, few mysteries captivate our imagination quite like the disappearance of entire legions without a trace, most notably the Legio IX Hispana, which vanished somewhere in the northern reaches of Britain around the 2nd century CE. This legion, once stationed at York, simply ceased to appear in official records, leaving behind no clear explanation for its fate, no final battle account, no recorded disbandment ceremony, only silence and absence where documentation should exist. Historians have proposed numerous theories to explain this mysterious vanishing. The Legion may have been catastrophically defeated by British or Scottish forces in some undocumented uprising, or perhaps it was gradually transferred eastward to reinforce the Parthian frontier, with its disappearance being merely a gradual administrative reorganization rather than a dramatic single event. The psychological mechanism that sustains this mystery is our human tendency to interpret absence as evidence of something extraordinary, something dramatic and unknowable, when in reality the absence of records in antiquity was far more common than their preservation, and many legions likely met unremarkable ends through attrition, disease, reassignment, and simple administrative reshuffling that left minimal historical trace. We have grown accustomed to treating Roman military records as though they were comprehensive and reliable, yet the reality is that much of what Rome accomplished and experienced went entirely unwritten or was lost to time, and what we call mysteries are often simply the inevitable gaps in our knowledge of a distant civilization. The Legio IX Hispana persists in our collective consciousness not because its fate is uniquely unknowable, but because it occupies that rare space between sufficient documentation to know it existed and insufficient documentation to know precisely what happened to it, creating a narrative voe. Around the year 120 AD, the Roman Ninth Legion, also known as Legio IX Hispana, vanished from historical records without a clear explanation, leaving behind one of the most persistent mysteries of the Roman Empire. This was not a small military unit, but rather a force of approximately 5,000 heavily trained soldiers, complete with officers, support staff, and equipment, stationed in Britain at the fortress of Eboracum, modern-day York. The Legion had established itself as a formidable presence throughout the British Isles, participating in campaigns against local tribes and maintaining Roman control over vast territories. Then, sometime in the early 2nd century, all records of this legion simply ceased to exist in any surviving documentation. No official reports detail their fate, no inscriptions commemorate their final battle, and no accounts explain what became of thousands of trained military personnel and their commanders. The mystery deepens because the Romans were meticulous record keepers, maintaining detailed accounts of military movements, garrison postings, and personnel assignments across their vast empire. The absence of such records is itself unusual and demands explanation. Various theories have emerged over the centuries, ranging from the plausible to the dramatic. Some historians suggest the legion was decimated during a catastrophic military campaign against rebellious tribes in Scotland or northern Britain, a defeat so severe that the empire chose to suppress the record rather than acknowledge such a profound military embarrassment. Others propose that the Ninth was simply transferred to another frontier, perhaps the Danube or the eastern provinces, and that the legion continued under different organizational structures or absorbed into other units, though this fails to explain the complete erasure from records. For centuries, European scholars and explorers pursued rumors of a magnificent Christian kingdom hidden somewhere beyond the known world, ruled by a legendary figure known as Prester John, a powerful priest-king whose domain supposedly contained unimaginable wealth, advanced technology, and an army of millions devoted to the Christian faith. The legend emerged during the 12th century, gaining particular momentum after a letter purportedly written by Prester John himself circulated throughout European courts, describing his vast territories, his control over 70 kings, his palace adorned with precious stones and jewels, and his possession of magical objects and fountains of youth that granted eternal vitality to those who drank from them. Merchants, missionaries, and conquistadors spent generations searching for this kingdom, convinced that its discovery would transform Christianity's standing in the world and provide crucial military alliances against Islamic powers that had long dominated Mediterranean trade routes and territorial expansion. The psychological mechanism driving this obsession lay in the profound human need to believe in hidden utopias and undiscovered powers that could solve pressing contemporary problems, combined with the genuine mystery of vast unexplored territories and the difficulty of verifying accounts from distant lands where communication moved at the speed of sailing vessels and where exaggeration naturally flourished in tales of wonder and riches. What makes the Prester John legend particularly fascinating is how it persisted despite its fundamental implausibility, as explorers continued modifying the kingdom's supposed location from Central Asia to Ethiopia to India whenever previous searches yielded nothing, demonstrating how humans unconsciously adjust beliefs to preserve their underlying hope rather than abandoning them entirely when confronted with contradictory evidence, illustrating our remarkable. For centuries, explorers and fortune seekers have pursued the legend of El Dorado, the mythical city of gold said to exist somewhere in the heart of South America, hidden beneath dense jungle canopy and accessible only to those with sufficient determination and resources. The legend originated during the Spanish conquest of the Americas, evolving from a ritual practiced by the Muisca people of present-day Colombia, where a new ruler would be covered in gold dust and make an offering to the gods in a sacred lake. But conquistadors and merchants transformed this ceremonial practice into tales of an entire golden city waiting to be discovered, filled with treasures beyond imagination. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, countless expeditions pushed into unmapped territories of Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, and Peru, each believing themselves on the verge of finding this legendary settlement, yet each returning empty-handed despite rigorous searching and genuine belief in the prize awaiting them. The psychological mechanism underlying El Dorado's persistence lies in humanity's fundamental tendency to externalize our deepest desires onto distant, inaccessible places, transforming abstract wealth and success into a concrete geographical location that feels almost real because it exists just beyond our current reach, always one more journey away. The legend persists despite overwhelming evidence that no such city has ever existed, because it satisfies a profound need within the human psyche to believe that untapped abundance remains hidden somewhere in the world, that fortune and transformation lie waiting for the brave or clever enough to find it. And this belief proves far more compelling than any logical analysis of failure rates or lack of evidence. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors and explorers venturing into the uncharted territories of what is now the American Southwest became captivated by persistent rumors of 7 magnificent cities of immeasurable wealth. Cities said to be constructed entirely of gold and precious stones, glittering in the desert sun with a brilliance that could allegedly be seen from miles away, cities known collectively as Cibola. The legend appeared to originate from a combination of sources, including accounts from shipwreck survivors, indigenous peoples' descriptions of distant lands, and earlier Portuguese and Spanish maritime traditions of mythical settlements that existed just beyond the horizon, perpetually out of reach, yet theoretically attainable to those with sufficient determination and resources. Conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado mounted an extensive expedition in 1540 that consumed years of effort, vast quantities of supplies, and the lives of numerous soldiers and indigenous auxiliaries, all in pursuit of locating these legendary cities, only to discover instead modest pueblo settlements that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the golden metropolises described in the tantalizing reports that had driven his quest. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent delusion rested fundamentally upon the human tendency to interpret ambiguous information through the lens of desire and expectation, combined with the natural human inclination to believe that legendary wealth must exist somewhere beyond one's current knowledge or reach, particularly when seeking justification for costly expeditions that required royal patronage and significant personal investment. The conquistadors possessed no reliable method of verifying claims about distant lands, and the fragmented accounts they received from indigenous populations, filtered through translation and cultural misunderstanding, easily transformed into increasingly Somewhere in the ancient world, according to biblical texts and historical tradition, King Solomon accumulated vast quantities of precious metals and gems through an empire of extraordinary wealth and influence. Yet despite centuries of searching across 3 continents, no archaeological evidence of these legendary mines has ever been conclusively discovered or verified. The biblical account describes Solomon as possessing more gold and silver than any ruler before or after him, ruling over an empire that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia, commanding fleets of ships that brought back exotic treasures from distant lands. Yet when archaeologists examine the actual remains of settlements and structures from the time period traditionally attributed to Solomon's reign around the 10th century before the Common Era, they find remarkably little material evidence of the extraordinary wealth that ancient texts claim must have existed. The mystery deepens because numerous locations have been proposed as possible sites for these legendary mines, including regions in modern-day Israel, Jordan, Ethiopia, Egypt, and even as far away as Zimbabwe and Peru, with each location attracting explorers and researchers who believed they had found definitive proof. Yet none of these claims have withstood rigorous archaeological scrutiny or produced undisputed artifacts that could be scientifically linked to Solomon's reign. The psychological mechanism driving this persistent search appears rooted in the human tendency to literalize religious and historical narratives, to transform mythological accounts into geographical puzzles that simply require the right map or the right excavation site to solve, a pattern of thinking that transforms fantastical stories into treasure hunts rather than recognizing them as allegorical or politically motivated constructions designed to glorify a particular ruler. Somewhere in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, according to legend, lies one of the most valuable mineral deposits ever discovered, a gold mine of such extraordinary richness that finding it would fundamentally alter the wealth of whoever claimed it. and for nearly 2 centuries, thousands of prospectors, adventurers, and fortune seekers have ventured into these treacherous desert canyons, searching for this elusive fortune. The story begins in the 1800s when a German immigrant, or perhaps a Dutch immigrant, depending on which account you believe, stumbled upon an outcropping of gold so pure and abundant that he kept its location secret, sharing only vague clues and cryptic maps with a handful of trusted associates before his death, leaving behind tantalizing hints but no definitive coordinates that anyone has successfully followed. The legend grew throughout the American West as word spread of the Dutchman's fortune, attracting desperate miners, con artists, and dreamers who believed that with the right combination of intelligence, luck, and persistence, they could decode the mysterious maps and locate the hidden riches before anyone else could claim them. The psychological mechanism underlying this enduring mystery operates on several levels simultaneously. The human tendency to find patterns in randomness, the romanticization of hidden treasure that promises to transform ordinary lives into extraordinary ones, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from pursuing an unsolved puzzle even when success seems statistically improbable. People continue searching for the lost Dutchman mine not merely because gold remains valuable, but because the search itself has become a narrative that people project themselves into, imagining their own triumphant discovery and the redemption that wealth would bring to their lives. Deep within the San Andres Mountains of New Mexico lies Victorio Peak, a remote and desolate location that has captivated treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists for decades with the legend of a vast hidden fortune. The story begins in the 1930s when a man named Milton Doc Noss claimed to have discovered a substantial cache of gold bars, coins, and artifacts secreted away within a natural cave system near the peak's summit, and he reportedly removed several bars from the site before the entrance was mysteriously sealed off, either by government intervention or by the mountain itself collapsing. Since that initial discovery, numerous expeditions have been mounted to locate the treasure, with searchers reporting strange interference from military personnel, government agencies preventing access to the area, and peculiar disappearances of equipment and documentation that would seem to verify the treasure's existence. The mechanism behind the persistence of this legend rests primarily on the tantalizing nature of partial evidence combined with institutional obstruction that appears deliberately designed to conceal rather than clarify the truth. The government's actual involvement with the Victorio Peak area stems from its proximity to White Sands Missile Range, a restricted military installation where sensitive weapons testing occurs. Yet this reasonable explanation for restricted access becomes conflated with more exotic theories about hidden wealth and clandestine operations. Over the decades, the legend has transformed into a narrative wherein every official denial becomes proof of cover-up, every locked gate becomes evidence of hidden riches, and every failed expedition becomes testimony to the existence of something worth protecting, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of belief that requires no actual discovery to perpetuate itself and continues to draw hopeful seekers to the New Mexico wilderness in pursuit of a fortune thaw. In the early 21st century, a millionaire art dealer and former fighter pilot named Forrest Fenn announced to the world that he had hidden a treasure chest somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, and he had written a cryptic poem containing clues that would lead persistent seekers to its location. Fenn claimed the chest contained over $2 million in gold coins, jewelry, and artifacts from his personal collection, and he published this poem in a memoir called The Thrill of the Chase in 2010. What began as a personal whimsy transformed into a genuine cultural phenomenon, attracting hundreds of thousands of treasure hunters from across the globe who spent years analyzing every word of the 24-line poem, searching through forests and alongside rivers, deciphering what they believed to be hidden meanings in the cryptic verse. The poem's vague geographical references and metaphorical language created an almost infinite number of possible interpretations, and with each passing year, the mystery deepened as Forrest Fenn periodically released additional hints through interviews and blog posts, keeping the interest alive and the speculation continually refreshed. The psychological appeal of this mystery lies in its fundamental promise of transformation through discovery, the romantic notion that somewhere out in the wilderness exists a tangible reward waiting for those clever and determined enough to solve the puzzle, which taps into ancient human desires for adventure and hidden treasure that have existed since time immemorial. The treasure hunt normalized the idea that a contemporary millionaire might think like a storyteller and puzzle maker, creating elaborate games for strangers to play. And in doing so, Fenn essentially transformed himself into a modern-day sphinx, offering riddles with genuine material stakes. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 2000, in the quiet residential neighborhood of Setagaya in Tokyo, Japan, a brutal and seemingly senseless crime unfolded that would become one of the nation's most perplexing unsolved murders. The Miyazawa family, consisting of 48-year-old Tsutomu, his wife Yasuko who was 41, their 10-year-old daughter Nikin, and their 6-year-old son Rei, were found murdered in their home in a manner that suggested both calculated violence and erratic, chaotic behavior. The perpetrator or perpetrators entered through an unlocked window and spent hours within the residence, attacking the family members repeatedly with extreme brutality, yet also seemingly lingering in the home afterward, consuming food, using the bathroom, and watching television as though inhabiting the space naturally. This extraordinary juxtaposition of frenzied violence and casual domestic behavior created a psychological puzzle that continues to perplex investigators and criminologists even today. The killer left behind abundant physical evidence including fingerprints, DNA material, footprints, and fibers. Yet despite one of the largest criminal investigations in Japanese history involving thousands of interviews and extensive forensic analysis, no definitive perpetrator has ever been identified or prosecuted. The mystery deepens when considering the psychological profile such evidence suggests. An individual or individuals capable of committing unspeakable violence against children and adults alike, yet also seemingly disorganized enough to leave such comprehensive traces and composed enough to pause within the crime scene for mundane activities. The case persists in Japanese popular consciousness as a reminder of how thoroughly violence can shatter the assumed safety of domestic spaces, and how despite technological advancement and investigative rigor, certain crimes remain inexplicable, their perpetrators seemingly. On the remote Bavarian farm known as Hinterkaifeck in March of 1922, one of the most disturbing and inexplicable mass murders in European history unfolded in almost complete isolation from the outside world. The farm itself sat several kilometers away from the nearest village, a place where winter snows could cut off inhabitants for weeks at a time. And it was here that 6 people, Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their 2 grandchildren Victoria and Joseph, Andreas's son-in-law Schwarzgruber, and the family's maidservant Maria, were murdered in ways that suggested a level of deliberate cruelty and planning that still haunts criminologists and historical researchers more than a century later. What makes this case so psychologically fascinating is not merely the brutality of the crimes themselves, but rather the profound mystery surrounding why the murders occurred and who perpetrated them, for despite investigations that lasted years, no definitive answers ever emerged to explain the motivations or identify the killer with absolute certainty. The perpetrator, whoever they were, apparently killed each victim with methodical precision, mutilating some bodies in ways that suggested rage, contempt, or some deep psychological disturbance that transcends ordinary human understanding. The bodies lay undiscovered for days, left in the cold farmhouse and buried in the snow outside, and when authorities finally arrived to investigate, they found a scene so disturbing that even experienced law enforcement officials struggled to comprehend what had occurred. What persists about the Hinterkaifeck murders, even now, is our collective inability to categorize them within the frameworks we normally use to understand human violence, because the isolation of the location, the methodical nature of the killings, the apparent lack of financial motive or romantic entanglement, and the complete absence of witnesses or reliable conf. Between the years of 1935 and 1938, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, fell into a state of profound terror as dismembered human remains began appearing throughout the urban landscape, discovered in abandoned buildings, along the banks of rivers, and in the thick brush of forgotten ravines, with at least 12 victims confirmed and possibly as many as 20 or more. Their bodies systematically severed at the torso and carefully arranged in ways that suggested a ritualistic and deeply psychological compulsion driving the killer's actions forward. The killer, who became known as the Torso Murderer or the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, demonstrated a level of anatomical knowledge and surgical precision that suggested either medical training or an obsessive study of human dissection. carefully removing heads, limbs, and internal organs with calculated methodology that spoke to a methodical rather than frenzied approach, indicating someone who took time with each victim and experienced some form of satisfaction in the process of dismemberment itself. The victims were predominantly marginalized individuals drawn from the transient population of Cleveland, homeless men and women of limited social connection, whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by a society that often failed to document or properly investigate the missing among the poor and vulnerable. The psychological mechanism operating within the killer's mind appears rooted in a pathological need for complete control and dehumanization, transforming living human beings into objects to be disassembled and rearranged, suggesting a profound disconnection from normal human empathy and a possible childhood trauma or familial violence that crystallized into these compulsive violent acts. Despite extensive investigations, multiple suspects, including the famous Dr. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans fell into a state of genuine terror as a mysterious killer known only as the Axeman stalked the streets, targeting Italian grocers and their families with brutal, ritualistic precision. The killer would typically gain entry to homes by chiseling out door panels, then attack sleeping victims with their own axes or straight razors, leaving behind scenes of unspeakable violence while the perpetrator vanished into the darkness without a trace or discernible motive. What made these crimes particularly disturbing was the deliberate signature the killer left at each scene. Careful, almost surgical mutilations that suggested purpose and planning, yet the murderer seemed to follow no rational criminal logic, stealing nothing in some cases, taking small amounts in others, and appearing to derive satisfaction solely from the act of violence itself. The case generated dozens of suspects and confessions, yet none could be definitively proven, and the killings simply ceased as mysteriously as they had begun, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a community forever marked by inexplicable fear. What persists about the Axeman case, even now more than a century later, is how it embodies our deep human need to impose meaning upon meaninglessness, our desperate attempt to construct narrative patterns from random acts of violence that defy all conventional explanation. We continue to discuss the Axeman, construct theories, propose suspects, and seek logical frameworks within which to contain the horror, perhaps because accepting that some acts remain utterly inexplicable threatens our fundamental sense of order and understanding in the world around us. Yet the Axeman endures in our collective memory precisely because he remains unsolved, a dark mirror reflecting our vulnerability to forces beyond comprehension, reminding us that some mysteries resist the neat conclusions we so despair. In the early hours of June 10, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, experienced one of the most brutal and inexplicable crimes in American history when an entire family and two houseguests were methodically murdered with an axe in their own home. The Moorhead family, consisting of parents Josiah and Sarah along with their 4 children, had invited 2 neighborhood children to stay the night, and in the darkness before dawn, an unknown assailant entered their residence and systematically killed all 8 people with savage precision, then covered the faces of the victims with clothing before fleeing into the rural landscape. The killer had apparently spent considerable time in the home after the murders, washing his hands, covering mirrors and windows, and leaving behind a scene so disturbing that it would haunt the community and law enforcement for decades to come. Multiple suspects emerged throughout the investigation, including a traveling preacher named George Kelly who confessed to the murders under questionable circumstances, and later a career criminal named Henry Moore, yet the evidence remained circumstantial and contradictory, leaving profound uncertainty about who actually committed these heinous acts. The psychological mechanism underlying such unsolved cases often involves the human tendency to seek closure and narrative resolution in the face of senseless violence, causing communities to fixate upon convenient suspects even when evidence proves inconclusive, and allowing confirmation bias to override rational investigation. We unconsciously hunger for the satisfaction of solved mysteries because unsolved violence represents a fundamental threat to our sense of order and safety in the world, and the prospect of an unknown killer remaining at large creates an unbearable anxiety that persists even across generations. On the 9th of February in 1946, 3 young children vanished without trace from a beach in Adelaide, South Australia, in what remains one of the country's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Jane, aged 9, and her two younger brothers, Arna, aged 6, and Grant, aged 4, had been playing on Glenelg Beach while their mother rested nearby, and within a matter of moments they simply disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only questions that have persisted for decades. The children were last seen by numerous beachgoers who noticed them playing in the shallow waters and sand, yet when their mother returned her attention to them after a brief interval, all three had vanished completely, and despite one of the most extensive search operations ever mounted in Australia at that time, no trace of the children was ever found. The mystery deepened as investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses, followed countless leads, and explored every conceivable theory from accidental drowning in the ocean to abduction by an unknown person or persons. Yet each line of inquiry led only to dead ends and frustrating ambiguities. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases involves our fundamental inability to accept that children can simply cease to exist without explanation, which drives us to construct increasingly elaborate theories and narratives in an attempt to impose order and meaning upon chaos. Our minds rebel against the notion of randomness and incompleteness, particularly when innocent lives are involved, creating a compulsive need to solve the unsolvable and find closure where none may exist. What remains particularly unsettling about the Beaumont case is how its persistence across 75 years reflects our collective discomfort with accepting that some disappearances may never be explained, and that the universe can occasionally accommodate the inexplicable without offering resolution or undurst. In November 1970, the charred remains of a woman were discovered in a remote ravine called Istillen, nestled in the mountains near Bergen, Norway, and from that moment forward, her identity would remain one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in Scandinavian criminal history. The body was found among the wreckage of a fire that had consumed her in what appeared to be a deliberate act, yet no one could determine who she was, why she had chosen this isolated location, or whether her death was truly by her own hand or something far more sinister. She had been staying in a local hotel under an assumed name, speaking with a distinctive accent that seemed to originate from no specific country, wearing only clothing with all the labels and identifying marks carefully removed or burned away, and carrying with her a collection of pills, valuables, and documents that suggested she was either preparing for something or running from something, or perhaps both. The woman had gone on long walks into the mountains each day, seemingly familiarizing herself with the terrain, and when she failed to return, searchers eventually found her lying in the ravine, her body positioned among empty pill bottles and the remnants of what had clearly been an intentional conflagration. What makes this case so persistently disturbing is that despite decades of investigation and countless theories proposed by amateur investigators and professional authorities alike, the fundamental questions remain utterly unanswered. No missing person report matching her description was ever filed anywhere in the world, no fingerprints or DNA matches revealed her identity across any database, and the psychological state that might explain her actions remains entirely speculative. The mechanisms of her anonymity suggest either an extraordinarily meticulous disappearance engineered by intelligence agencies, a deeply disturbed individual determined to erase all traces of her existence. On the afternoon of August 10, 1901, two respectable English women named Charlotte Ann Moberly and Elinor Jourdain were visiting the Palace of Versailles near Paris. And as they wandered through the gardens attempting to locate the Petit Trianon, they reported experiencing a series of deeply unsettling and inexplicable phenomena that would occupy scholarly attention for more than a century. Both women independently described the landscape becoming subtly wrong, the colors and light taking on a peculiar, washed-out quality, and they encountered various figures dressed in period costumes from the 1870s or earlier, including a woman in a white dress and a man who appeared to be Marie Antoinette herself. The two observers felt an overwhelming sense of dread and displacement, and when they finally escaped the disorienting area and returned to their normal surroundings, they discovered that far more time had passed than they believed, though their accounts of the duration would later become notoriously inconsistent. This experience haunted both women so profoundly that Moberly spent decades investigating the incident, eventually publishing an account under a pseudonym titled An Adventure, which claimed they had somehow briefly slipped backward through time to witness the palace as it existed in the 1790s. The psychological mechanism underlying such experiences likely involves a combination of genuine atmospheric anomalies, the power of suggestion, cultural expectation about what one should encounter in historically significant places, and the human mind's extraordinary capacity to retrofit sensory experiences into coherent but false narratives, particularly when experiencing disorientation or stress. Over the subsequent decades, skeptics pointed out that the women had simply been lost in an unfamiliar garden, mistaken actors or eccentric visitors for period-dressed ghosts, and confused about their timeline due. On the morning of February 8, 1840, the residents of Devonshire, England awoke to discover something that would perplex the region for generations to come. A series of mysterious footprints that had appeared overnight across the snow-covered landscape in a pattern so strange and extensive that it seemed almost impossibly deliberate in its execution. These prints, which became known as the Devil's Footprints, stretched across an estimated 90 miles of the Devon countryside, passing through gardens, over rooftops, along narrow alleyways, and across frozen rivers in a continuous trail that appeared to follow no logical path or destination whatsoever. The prints themselves were distinctive and troubling to those who examined them, appearing as a single line of cloven hoofprints, roughly 4 inches long and 2.5 inches wide, pressed deeply into the snow with a regularity that suggested an enormous creature with an impossible stride had walked methodically through the night. Eyewitnesses reported an overwhelming sense of dread and violation, describing how the prints seemed to have bypassed locked gates and traversed vertical surfaces in ways that defied rational explanation, leading many residents to flee their homes in genuine terror. The event sparked immediate speculation about supernatural causes, with many villagers convinced that the devil himself had walked through their countryside, marking his presence upon the land in a deliberate demonstration of his power and dominion over the English countryside. Newspapers of the time sensationalized the incident, printing dramatic accounts and illustrations that spread the story across the nation, amplifying the mystery and the collective anxiety surrounding it. The psychological explanation for this phenomenon likely rests in the power of pattern recognition and collective hallucination, wherein once the initial prints were discovered and interpreted through a L. In 1924, a steel-hulled cargo ship named the SS Beichimo set sail from Vancouver, bound for the Arctic with supplies and trade goods destined for remote outposts in the frozen north. But what would unfold across the following decades would transform this ordinary vessel into one of the most persistent maritime mysteries in history. The ship became trapped in pack ice near Barrow, Alaska, in October of that year, and as the crew waited for rescue during the brutal Arctic winter, the vessel drifted helplessly across the vast, desolate seascape, ultimately becoming abandoned when its crew was evacuated to safety. What makes the Beichimo unique among ghost ship legends is not simply that it vanished or was lost at sea, but rather that it was repeatedly sighted, photographed, and documented by multiple witnesses across subsequent decades, creating an almost paradoxical phenomenon where a ship could simultaneously be considered lost and yet repeatedly found, alive, and yet ghostly in its persistence. Hunters, whalers, and explorers reported seeing the Beichimo throughout the 1920s, 30s, and even into the 1960s, with sightings occurring across thousands of square miles of Arctic Ocean and coastline, each encounter adding another layer to the mystery, while simultaneously raising more questions about how a ship could remain visible, identifiable, and yet always beyond reach. The psychological mechanism behind the Beichimo legend lies in the intersection of human pattern recognition and environmental unpredictability, where the Arctic's extreme conditions create conditions that seem to preserve structures in ways that defy conventional understanding, allowing a ship to drift, freeze, thaw, and resurface in patterns that feel almost deliberate or supernatural rather than merely random. Around the end of the Bronze Age, roughly 1,300 years before the Common Era, the Mediterranean world experienced a catastrophic period of upheaval and collapse that saw the fall of mighty civilizations including the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, and the great kingdoms of Egypt and the Levant. And at the heart of this tumultuous era stands one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. The identity of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders whose coordinated attacks on coastal settlements and shipping routes appear in Egyptian records and archaeological evidence, yet remain fundamentally unknowable in their origins and true composition. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III documented his conflicts with these mysterious invaders, describing them in temple inscriptions as groups with names like the Shurden, the Peliset, the Tejeker, and the Weshesh. Yet despite centuries of scholarly investigation, no definitive consensus has emerged regarding where these peoples actually originated, whether they were unified under single leadership or merely opportunistic raiders of similar maritime capability, or whether they were displaced populations fleeing their own collapsing homelands or organized military forces executing a coordinated campaign of conquest. The psychological grip this mystery maintains lies in how it represents a fundamental gap in our understanding of history itself, a moment when entire civilizations vanished from the historical record and we are left with fragmentary inscriptions, scattered archaeological remains, and educated speculation about causation and identity that cannot be verified. What allows this mystery to persist despite our vast archives, our technological advances in archaeology and carbon dating, and our centuries of scholarly attention is precisely the incompleteness of the historical record from this era, for the sea peoples left no cities with their names written upon them, no Tem. High in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia, at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, stands the mysterious archaeological site of Pumapunku, a pre-Incan ceremonial complex that has puzzled researchers and scholars for centuries with its inexplicably sophisticated construction techniques and precision engineering. The site, whose name translates to Gate of the Puma in the Aymara language, features massive stone blocks that were quarried, shaped, and fitted together with such extraordinary accuracy that a knife blade cannot be inserted between many of the joints, a level of precision that seems to defy the technological capabilities that historians and archaeologists attribute to the Tiwanaku civilization, who built it sometime between 1,500 and 3,000 years ago. The largest stones at Pumapunku weigh over 100 tons, and some of the blocks feature intricate interlocking joints, perfectly cut angles, and detailed carvings that would require advanced mathematical knowledge, sophisticated stoneworking tools, and an organizational system capable of coordinating thousands of workers across extended periods. The mystery deepens when one considers that the site sits at such an extreme altitude and in such an isolated location, requiring the transportation of massive stones over difficult terrain without the benefit of wheels, draft animals suited to that environment, or any clear evidence of the technological infrastructure that would have made such a feat possible. Conventional archaeological explanations suggest that the Tiwanaku people possessed remarkable engineering knowledge passed down through generations and developed innovative techniques for quarrying and moving stone. Yet no clear evidence of intermediate stages in this technological development has been discovered, no partial structures showing experimental phases, and no detailed tools or equipment that could have produced such precision. Among the most captivating artifacts in the world of antiquarian mystery are the crystal skulls, intricate carvings fashioned from quartz that have sparked decades of fascination and controversy regarding their true origins and purpose. These remarkable objects, ranging from small figurines to life-sized representations, emerged into public consciousness primarily through museums and private collections during the 19th and 20th centuries, with the most famous example being the Mitchell Hedges skull, allegedly discovered in the jungles of Belize by an explorer and his adopted daughter in the 1936 expedition. The skulls possess an undeniable aesthetic appeal, demonstrating sophisticated carving techniques and a haunting quality that seems to invite speculation about ancient wisdom and lost civilizations. Yet the scientific evidence surrounding their creation tells a fundamentally different story than the romantic narratives that have accumulated around them. Modern archaeological analysis and material examination have conclusively demonstrated that virtually all authenticated crystal skulls were carved during the 19th century, most likely in Germany or Mexico, during a period when European craftsmen possessed advanced tools and techniques capable of working with such precision on crystalline materials, and the wear patterns, tool marks, and manufacturing methods all align with industrial rather than ancient production. The psychological mechanism driving the persistent belief in the ancient origin of these skulls stems from our deep human yearning to discover evidence of advanced ancient civilizations, a desire that combines with the intrinsic beauty of the objects themselves to create a compelling narrative that feels intuitively true despite contradicting empirical evidence. Hidden within the rolling landscape of West Dunbartonshire in Scotland lies one of Britain's most enigmatic archaeological treasures, a massive slab of stone known as the Kochno Stone, which has puzzled scholars and researchers for centuries with its intricate and purposeful markings that seem to contain meaning just beyond our grasp. The stone itself measures approximately 13 feet long and 9 feet wide, its surface covered entirely with hundreds of carved symbols, geometric patterns, and mysterious cup and ring markings that were painstakingly created by someone in the distant past, likely during the Neolithic or Bronze Age periods, suggesting a sophistication and intentionality that speaks to profound cultural significance. The patterns consist of elaborate spirals that seem to dance across the rock face, concentric circles that draw the eye inward toward some invisible center, meandering lines that connect various elements in ways that suggest deliberate communication or spiritual mapping, and countless carefully indented cups that vary in depth and diameter, as if following some cosmic or mathematical schema that remains just outside the boundaries of modern understanding. What makes the Kochno stone so deeply mysterious is not merely that we cannot definitively read its meaning, but rather that we have never even discovered a Rosetta Stone equivalent that might unlock its secrets through comparison with other contemporary cultures or known symbolic systems from that ancient era. The archaeological community has proposed numerous theories over the decades, suggesting that the markings might represent astronomical observations or a star chart, that they could indicate territorial boundaries or ritual pathways for shamanic journeys, that they possibly encode a narrative or genealogy of ancient peoples, or that they might simply be expressions of artistic or spiritual vision without literal meaning as we would understand it. In the spring of 1848, in a modest wooden house on Hydesville Road near Rochester, New York, the Fox family began experiencing peculiar and inexplicable sounds that would ignite one of the most significant paranormal phenomena of the 19th century. The disturbances manifested as rhythmic knocking noises emanating from the walls and floors of their home, sounds that seemed to respond intelligently to questions posed by family members, creating an impression of communication with unseen entities. The youngest daughters, Margaret and Catherine Fox, claimed they could interpret these knockings as messages from a murdered peddler whose body was allegedly buried in the cellar, and news of these supernatural events spread rapidly through the community, attracting curious visitors and skeptics alike who gathered to witness the phenomena firsthand. The story captivated the public imagination during an era when interest in spiritualism was flourishing, and the Rochester knockings became the catalyst for the widespread spiritualist movement that would sweep across America and Europe for decades to come. What likely occurred within that household was a combination of ordinary household sounds amplified by psychological suggestion and the power of expectation, where creaking floorboards, settling foundations, and animal movements became reinterpreted as intelligent communication once the narrative of supernatural contact had been established in the family's collective consciousness. The human mind possesses a remarkable tendency to find patterns and meaning in random phenomena, particularly when primed by cultural beliefs about the afterlife and spiritual realms, and the interpretation of ambiguous sounds as purposeful messages represents a fundamental aspect of how our brains construct reality from sensory information. In the early 19th century, in Robertson County, Tennessee, the Bell family experienced a series of extraordinary phenomena that would become one of America's most documented paranormal cases, beginning in 1817 when strange noises, unexplained scratching sounds, and the sensation of invisible forces disturbed their home near the Red River. The disturbances escalated dramatically over months, with family members reporting being struck by invisible hands, bedclothes torn from sleeping bodies in the night, and disembodied voices that eventually developed distinct personalities, particularly one claiming to be the spirit of a murdered woman named Kate Batts seeking revenge against the family patriarch John Bell. The phenomena were witnessed by numerous visitors, local clergy, and prominent citizens of the time who came to investigate, many of whom corroborated the accounts of levitating objects, inexplicable noises, and the voice's ability to recite scripture and engage in theological debate with impressive eloquence and knowledge. The psychological mechanism underlying such mass phenomena typically involves a combination of factors including heightened suggestibility within a community during periods of social uncertainty, the power of expectation and confirmation bias among investigators and witnesses who arrived predisposed to encounter something extraordinary. And the human tendency to construct narratives that explain ambiguous sensory experiences through supernatural frameworks, rather than accepting them as random noise or misinterpretation. The case demonstrates how grief, guilt, and interpersonal conflict within the family unit, particularly tensions surrounding John Bell's disputed land claims and his reputation in the community, could manifest as psychological projection whereby unconscious anxieties become externalized as malevolent entities, allowing the afflicted to process trauma through the language of spiritual. In August of 1977, the quiet suburban neighborhood of Enfield in North London became the epicenter of one of the most extensively documented paranormal phenomena in modern history, when the Hodgson family began experiencing inexplicable disturbances that would captivate investigators, skeptics, and believers alike for months to come. The initial incidents centered around 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, whose bedroom became ground zero for phenomena that included furniture moving of its own accord, objects levitating and flying across rooms, disembodied voices emanating from the walls, and knockings that seemed to come from within the very structure of the house itself. Investigators from the Society for Psychical Research documented hundreds of occurrences, with some witnesses reporting that they observed chairs rising several feet off the ground while the child sat nearby, and water mysteriously appearing in sealed containers. The disturbances were so persistent and varied that they attracted attention from paranormal researchers, journalists, and even a notable magician who attempted to identify tricks or deceptions. The phenomena reportedly included a deep, guttural voice claiming to be the ghost of a former resident, communications through automatic writing, and physical injuries to family members that appeared without visible cause. Yet despite the extensive eyewitness testimony and documented incidents, skeptics pointed to the possibility of deliberate fraud, unconscious psychological manipulation, or even elaborate staging by attention-seeking adolescents, noting that poltergeist activity has historically centered around pubescent children whose emotional turbulence might manifest in psychokinetic expressions. The case persists in our collective consciousness as a fascinating boundary point where the observable meets the inexplicable, where numerous credible witnesses encountered phenomena that defied conventional explanations. In December of 1894, 3 lighthouse keepers vanished without a trace from Eilean Moor, a remote Scottish island in the Outer Hebrides, leaving behind one of the most perplexing disappearances in maritime history that continues to haunt researchers and mystery enthusiasts to this very day. The 3 men, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were stationed at the Flannan Isles lighthouse, a beacon of safety meant to guide ships through treacherous waters. Yet on the morning of December 26th, when a relief crew arrived at the island to check on the keepers, they found the lighthouse abandoned, the beds still unmade, food left uneaten on tables, and evidence suggesting the men had simply vanished into thin air. What makes this mystery particularly unsettling is the abundance of contradictory physical evidence found at the scene, including an overturned chair, a missing oilskin coat, a kitchen door left open to the elements, and an empty crane that had been used to haul supplies from the rocky shore, leading investigators to propose theories ranging from a freak wave washing the men into the sea while they performed routine maintenance, to supernatural intervention, to deliberate escape, to murder. With each hypothesis failing to adequately explain every mysterious detail discovered. The psychological mechanism operating within this mystery stems from humanity's deep-seated need to impose narrative order upon chaos and ambiguity, transforming a tragic but ultimately mundane accident into something more sinister or extraordinary, allowing us to feel that the universe operates according to comprehensible rules rather than random misfortune. The Eilean Moor disappearance persists in our collective consciousness not because new evidence has emerged to validate any particular theory, but rather because the incompleteness of the historical record allows multiple interpretations to coexist indefinitely, each. Among the most profound mysteries of biblical and historical scholarship lies the question of who actually wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient manuscripts discovered beginning in 1947 in caves near Qumran in the West Bank. The scrolls, numbering in the hundreds and dating primarily to between the 2nd century before Christ and the 1st century after, contain fragments of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible alongside numerous other religious texts, community rules, and apocalyptic writings that have no parallel in any surviving ancient literature. Despite decades of intensive scholarly examination, paleographic analysis, and radiocarbon dating, the true authorship of these documents remains fundamentally uncertain and deeply contested among experts who have devoted entire careers to their study. The prevailing scholarly consensus attributes many of the scrolls to a Jewish sect, possibly the Essenes, who may have inhabited the Qumran settlement and carefully preserved their religious library in these caves. Yet this theory rests on circumstantial evidence and ancient historical accounts rather than definitive proof, leaving substantial room for alternative interpretations and ongoing scholarly debate. What makes this mystery particularly vexing is that the scrolls themselves provide tantalizing clues without offering conclusive answers, containing references to a teacher of righteousness and various community leaders whose identities remain obscured by time and the fragmentary nature of the texts themselves. The psychological mechanism that sustains this enduring mystery involves our human tendency to construct elaborate narratives around incomplete information, filling gaps with reasonable assumptions that eventually calcify into accepted historical frameworks. Yet each new discovery or re-examination of the scrolls threatens to upend these carefully constructed theories. Stretching across the Arabian desert for nearly 900 kilometers, the Khat Shebib Wall represents one of archaeology's most perplexing linear structures, a massive fortification that winds through the barren landscape of modern-day Jordan and Syria with no clear strategic purpose or obvious explanation for its existence. This monumental construction, built entirely from stacked black basalt stones without mortar, rises to heights of up to 2 meters in some sections, while remaining remarkably consistent in its width and construction methodology throughout its entire length. Yet archaeologists and historians have struggled for decades to understand who built it, when precisely it was constructed, and what function it was ever meant to serve. The wall's routing defies conventional military logic, as it does not follow natural geographic boundaries such as mountain ranges or river valleys, nor does it connect to any known settlements or fortifications that would suggest it was designed to protect specific territories or control trade routes passing through the region. Carbon dating and pottery analysis suggest the structure may have been built sometime between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, though some researchers argue for earlier or later dates, creating a chronological ambiguity that only deepens the mystery surrounding its purpose and construction. The Nabateans, the Romans, and various Arab tribes have all been proposed as potential builders, yet no conclusive evidence definitively attributes the wall to any single civilization or group, leaving historians to speculate endlessly about its origins. What makes the Khat Shebib particularly enigmatic is how its massive scale and construction efforts speak to a society capable of organizing tremendous labor and resources. Yet we possess almost no written records, inscriptions, or clear archaeological context that might explain the motivations behind such an enormous und. High in the mountains of Peru, overlooking the ancient city of Cusco, stands an architectural marvel that has puzzled engineers and archaeologists for centuries. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman, whose massive stone walls contain some of the most precisely fitted megaliths ever constructed by human hands. These enormous granite and limestone blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, fit together so perfectly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Yet they were allegedly quarried and positioned without the use of mortar, metal tools, or written architectural plans, using only the technological capabilities attributed to the Inca civilization around the 15th century. The precision of these stone joints remains so extraordinary that modern masonry experts struggle to explain how such accuracy could have been achieved with bronze tools and stone hammers. As the stones conform to each other in complex, irregular polygonal patterns that would require extraordinary geometric knowledge and craftsmanship to accomplish. The mystery deepens when considering the sheer scale of the endeavor, as historians estimate that constructing Sacsayhuaman would have required the labor of tens of thousands of workers over many decades, moving stones across mountainous terrain without wheeled vehicles or beast-of-burden assistance. Yet archaeological evidence of labor camps, tool marks, and construction records remains scarce. The human mind naturally seeks explanations for such extraordinary feats, and in the absence of complete historical documentation, this gap has allowed alternative theories to flourish, from speculative claims about lost advanced technologies to suggestions that the structures predate the Inca civilization itself. even though such theories lack archaeological support and contradict the substantial evidence linking Sacsayhuaman to Inca construction practices and historical records. In the remote highlands of central Laos, scattered across a vast landscape of rolling terrain, there exists a phenomenon that has puzzled archaeologists and historians for nearly a century. Thousands upon thousands of enormous stone jars arranged seemingly without pattern or purpose across what locals call the Plain of Jars. These monolithic vessels, some standing as tall as a person and weighing several tons, dot the landscape in clusters and groupings that suggest deliberate placement, yet their original function remains shrouded in mystery and speculation. The jars themselves are crafted from solid stone, hollowed out with remarkable precision by methods that remain unclear, and they display varying degrees of weathering and deterioration that suggest they have rested in this location for centuries, if not millennia. Archaeological expeditions have documented over 3,000 of these jars across the region, though many more may lie hidden beneath the earth or have been destroyed over time. The prevailing theories suggest these vessels may have served as burial receptacles for ancient peoples, possibly containing cremated remains or funerary goods, yet the lack of consistent skeletal evidence and the absence of clear patterns in their arrangement leave these explanations incomplete and unsatisfying. What persists despite decades of scholarly investigation is the profound disconnect between the obvious intentionality of their creation and placement, and our persistent inability to understand why an entire civilization would undertake such an enormous, labor-intensive project. The jars continue to stand silently across the landscape, silent witnesses to forgotten purposes and lost knowledge, while modern observers circle around them with questions that may never find answers, accepting their mystery as simply another chapter in humanity's forgotten past. Deep within the mountains of Zhejiang province in eastern China lies one of the world's most perplexing archaeological enigmas, a network of artificial caverns known as the Longyu Caves, which challenge everything we thought we understood about ancient engineering and human capability. These 24 massive chambers, some stretching over 17,000 square meters in total area, were carved entirely from solid rock with such precision and scale that modern engineers have struggled to comprehend how they could have been created without contemporary machinery or documented historical records. The caves feature perfectly smooth walls, intricate drainage systems, and carved stone pillars that support enormous ceilings. Yet there exists virtually no written record of their construction, no archaeological evidence of tools or debris that would explain their creation, and no clear understanding of who built them or when they were actually excavated. What makes this mystery even more profound is that the caves were essentially lost to time, discovered and rediscovered by locals, their true significance only recently recognized by the modern world. The psychological mechanism that makes us accept this enigma without immediate answers stems from our tendency to compartmentalize mysteries that fall outside our conventional historical frameworks, to assume that lost knowledge from antiquity simply vanishes rather than challenging our understanding of what ancient peoples could accomplish. We have normalized the Longyu Caves as simply one more curiosity in China's vast landscape, yet they represent something far more unsettling: evidence that significant human achievements can exist for thousands of years without leaving behind explanatory records, without fitting neatly into archaeological timelines, without providing us the documentation we have come to expect from history. High in the Andes Mountains of Peru, overlooking the ancient city of Cusco, stands an architectural marvel that has puzzled researchers and engineers for centuries. Sacsayhuaman, a massive fortress constructed from enormous stone blocks fitted together with such extraordinary precision that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, yet no mortar was used in their assembly. The structure consists of 3 parallel walls stretching nearly half a mile in length, with the largest stones weighing as much as 200 tons, and these massive blocks are cut into intricate polygonal shapes that interlock with one another in patterns so complex and so perfectly executed that modern architects struggle to explain how such accuracy could have been achieved with only bronze tools and human labor. The precision of these joints is so remarkable that they have not only survived centuries of earthquakes that have devastated surrounding buildings, but the earthquakes themselves appear to have further strengthened the structure by settling the stones even more tightly together, creating a system of construction that seems almost impossibly advanced for a civilization without written language or the wheel. The psychological mechanism behind our fascination with Saxe-Human rests in the cognitive dissonance created when we confront evidence of technical mastery that appears to exceed what we believe a pre-industrial society should have been capable of achieving, which compels us to either reconsider the limitations we have assigned to ancient civilizations or to search for alternative explanations that preserve our existing frameworks of understanding. Yet despite decades of archaeological study and the accumulation of substantial evidence that the Inca possessed sophisticated mathematical knowledge, precise surveying techniques, and organizational systems capable of mobilizing massive labor forces across difficult terrain, the fortress continues to. In the Brittany region of northwestern France, near the small village of Carnac, there exists one of the world's most enigmatic megalithic phenomena. Approximately 3,000 standing stones arranged in nearly perfect parallel lines stretching across the landscape for several kilometers. These weathered granite megaliths, ranging from modest heights of a few feet to towering structures over 20 feet tall, form an alignment so geometrically precise that it defies conventional explanation for a phenomenon created during the Neolithic period, somewhere between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. The stones appear intentionally organized into distinct rows, suggesting a unified vision and extraordinary organizational effort. Yet no historical records, artifacts, or conclusive archaeological evidence has ever definitively explained why an entire civilization devoted such immense labor and resources to this peculiar arrangement. The sheer scale of the undertaking is staggering. Researchers estimate that quarrying, transporting, and positioning these 3,000 stones would have required thousands of workers laboring for generations, a commitment that seems disproportionate to any practical or immediately apparent purpose. The human mind naturally seeks patterns and meaning in large-scale order, instinctively assuming that such deliberate arrangement must serve some profound function, whether ceremonial, astronomical, territorial, or spiritual. This psychological impulse to attribute intentionality and significance to organized structures leads us to propose countless theories: astronomical alignments with celestial bodies, sacred processional pathways, territorial markers, healing sites, or ritualistic gathering spaces. Yet upon careful examination, none of these explanations consistently holds across all sections of the alignment, and archaeological evidence remains frustratingly inconclusive.